So welcome everybody to our special class this evening. And before I begin, I just want to give a special thanks to the team of Project Likkutei Sichos, the power team of Project Likkutei Sichos, for bringing us together tonight and for all of their other amazing initiatives to be able to inspire so many of our brothers and sisters in learning Likkutei Sichos. I want to especially thank my dear friends, Rabbi Shlomi Greenwald and Rabbi Shmuley Nachlas, Rabbi Yisrael Wilhelm, Rabbi Moshe Legarari, who are behind the Project Likkutei Sichos. May you go from strength to strength. And thank you for bringing us all together tonight and for so many other classes in the past, and Be'ezer Hashem in the future. I also want to invite everybody to our ongoing classes. Monday and Thursday morning, 7:30 a.m. We have a ongoing class in Chassidus. We now started Derech Mitzvah Sicha, Mitzvahs Tiglachas Mitzvah, the mitzvah of shaving the Mitzvah, one of the fundamental mitzvahs in Derech Mitzvah Sicha by the Tzemach Tzedek. We're going to continue tomorrow, Thursday morning, 7:30. Everybody is invited, as well to our Tuesday Parshas Shir, Tuesday 12:45. And all of these are live streamed on the website, theyeshiva.net, THEYESHIVA.net. Everybody is invited. So please open your source sheets, because this is going to be a text-based class and quite an intense one. So if you go to theyeshiva.net, you'll see the first class, Hadran by the Lubavitcher Rebbe on Mesechta Kinin, the secret of Jewish history. There is a source sheet below the video. You can download the source sheet onto your computer, or on the right side of the video, you could just bring up the source sheet onto your computer. You can also get the source sheets every week on the website of Project LikkuteisiChos.com. I mentioned this a few times. The Lubavitcher Rebbe would present siyumim on Mesechtas, which means he would conclude tractates of Gemara, sometimes the whole Shas, a few times a year. Usually at the Farbrengens associated with Yartzites, the Rebbe would make a siyum on a Mesechta. This Sicha that we're going to learn today, the Rebbe said on Chaf Av Tavshin Lamed Zayin, the 20th of Av, 1977. The 20th of Av, of course, is the Yartzeit of his father, Hagon HaMekubal Rebbe Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. And each year on Chaf Av, the Rebbe would hold a long Farbrengen, and among the highlights of the Farbrengen was a grand siyum Mesechta. The Rebbe would make a siyum on a Mesechta and is exploring the lumdus, the pilpul, and the meaning of the end of the Mesechta and the beginning of the Mesechta. Some of these siyumim are what you may call timeless classics. Just a few weeks ago, we learned together the siyum on Meseches Chagiga that was also said on Chaf Av. That was Chaf Av Tavshin Lamed Aleph, 1971. But today we're going to learn Chaf Av Tavshin Lamed Zayin, 1977. And this is a siyum that the Rebbe made on Mishnayos Meseches Kinin, which is the last tractate of Seder Kachim. So he said then that he's making a siyum on Meseches Kinin and the whole Seder Kachim, the whole order, the section of Shas of Kachim, and the last Mishnayos, which doesn't have Gemara on it, is Meseches Kinin, and the Sicha was continued on the Shabbos Farbrengen of Parshas Eikev Lamed Zayin, and then continued Shabbos Parshas Re'eh Lamed Zayin, and these Sichas were compiled and edited, and parts of them were published in Likkutei Sichos, volume 17, the second Sicha for Parshas Tazria. As most of these Sichas, they were said in Yiddish, and they were transcribed in Yiddish, so we're going to learn them in Yiddish, and of course I will translate Be'ezer Hashem for those who don't have or have mastered the Yiddish language. Okay, so please open your source sheets. Let's begin. Before we begin the actual Sicha, as always, we need a little introduction to be able to understand the concept. So it all begins with an innocent pasuk in the opening of Parshas Tazria. The Torah speaks about the opening of Tazria's Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zachar. A woman gives birth either to a male, to a female, to a boy, or to a girl. And there was an obligation for a woman who gave birth to bring an offering, to bring a carbon after a certain period of time, following the birth either of the male child or the female child. As the Torah says, if you open up your source sheets, you'll see the source sheets. We have the Sicha. The Sicha is there, right? But at the end of the Sicha, we have the actual source sheets the project Likkutei Sichos prepared. That's page 11 in your source sheet. So please go there. Page 11. And there you have the first source. Parshas Tazria, Perik Yud Beis, Pasuk Zayin. Leviticus chapter 12, verse 7 and 8. Uvim lo yisimei Torah leveina levas. Tavi keves ben shnasei la'oila v'nyoina asar lechatas al pesach al maidel hakayin. When the days of purity are up, either for the birth of a son or the birth of a daughter, the mother ought to bring a sheep as a carbon oila, as an oila offering, and in addition to that, a second offering, either a young pigeon called a ben yaina or a turtle dove called a tar. She brings that as a chatas known as a sin offering, and she brings it, of course, to the sanctuary, to the Mishkan, or later to the Beis HaMikdash, where the kohen would offer it. And the pasuk continues, Ve'im loy simtza yada. I'm sorry, I said Zayin Ches. This is Pasuk Ches, verse 8. Ve'im loy simtza yada deisa. What happens if she can't afford a sheep because of poverty? Then the woman takes either 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, 2 young doves, and she offers. One is an oila, a complete burnt offering, that's called an oila, and the other one is a chatas, a sin offering, and the kohen shall effect atonement, and she becomes completely pure. So we have her 2 options that the Torah gives. Option number 1 is if she can afford it, she brings one offering, which is a sheep, and the other one, which is a young pigeon or a turtle dove. Or if she's poor, she brings 2 offerings, but both of them are turtle doves, or both of them are young pigeons, and of course that would be much more affordable because a sheep would be much more expensive and pricey than a bird, and this becomes an offering of an island, an offering of a chatas. Mesechta Kinin. What does Kinin mean? The word kain is the Talmudic term, the Mishnah term for a pair of birds. So when a poor woman brings 2 birds, and you have to understand that there were only 2 types of birds that were allowed to be brought as a carbon in the Beis HaMikdash. Only 2. There weren't many types of birds that you could bring, even kosher birds. Most of the birds are kosher. Only 2 types of birds you could bring to the Beis HaMikdash or to the Mishkan as an offering. Only a tur and a ben yaina. A young pigeon, a ben yaina, and a turtle dove. That's it. Kain, kuf nun, today we call kan as a nest, but kain here is not a nest, it's a pair of birds, which means a set of 2 birds that the woman brings as an offering. And by the way, there were another 5 instances where people were obligated, men or women, to bring a pair of birds as an offering to the Beis HaMikdash. Another 5 instances in halacha. Most of the cases were women who brought them after birth, but you have the case of a zav and a zava, you have the case of a mitzayra, a leper. When he becomes pure, also has to bring 2 birds. You also have the case of a nazir who becomes impure. You have 6 cases in halacha where you bring 6 scenarios in halacha where you bring, specifically it's actually more than 6, but 6 scenarios where you bring 2 birds. This is called a kain. A kain is a set, a pair of birds. One becomes a carbon oila, one becomes a carbon chatas. Why do you need a tractate from Mishnayos for this? Mesechta Kinin. Kinim is the plural of kain. Kain is 1 pair, and kinim are pairs of birds, sets of birds. Because here's the issue. The issue is as follows. The processing of a carbon oila was very different than the processing of a carbon chatas in different ways. But one of the primary differences is what you did with the blood. After the kohen killed the bird, and there was a process how he killed the bird, which was called melika, through the nape of the bird, and the bird died, which was akin to slaughtering, but it wasn't slaughtered. It was a different process called melika. The kohen needed to place part of the blood of the bird on the mizbeach, on the altar, which is done by every single carbon. But here is a difference between the oila sa'if and the chatas sa'if. The bird that was brought as a carbon oila, the bird that was brought as a carbon chatas. The bird that was brought as a carbon oila, the blood had to be placed on the higher part of the altar. The altar, the mizbeach, was divided by a chut hasikra, by a red string that was a division between the higher part of the altar and the lower part of the altar. When there was a bird that was brought as an oila, the blood was placed on the higher part. When there was a chatas, the blood was placed on the lower part. We learn out from the Torah that if you confuse the two, which means the oila goes to the lower part and the chatas goes to the higher part, the carbon is invalid, it's disqualified. So here is the issue of Mesechta Kinin. Most of the tractate deals with a situation where birds get mixed up. The carbon oila bird gets mixed up with the carbon chatas bird, and that creates a halachic confusion what should be done. And this is what the Mesechta deals with in so many different scenarios. It has 3 chapters, and it goes through very many scenarios after it establishes in the beginning of the tractate the main rules governing the Oila bird and the Chatas bird. We now come to the last Mishnah of Mesechta Kinin, and again there's 3 chapters, so this is the last Mishnah of the 3rd chapter. The last Mishnah is a very complicated one. A lot of many mathematical equations, a lot of calculations you have to hold. In Yiddish it's called Medaf Halten Cup. You have to keep focused because there's a lot of complexities of how it works. But here is the thrust of the issue, and that is a major confusion happens. And when this major confusion happens, we get into a big mess. And the halachic question is what we do. So let's see. Siyum Mesechta Kinin, your second source in the source sheet. This is the last mission of Kinin. Ha'isha sha'amra, a woman who said, Harei alai kain k'she'elet zachar. She says, if God grants me this blessing and I'm going to give birth to my baby boy, I want to bring a kain, a pair of birds, as a special contribution to Hashem, to the Beis HaMikdash. Now, Yalda Zachar, Baruch Hashem, it happens. She had a baby, everything is good. Meviyish Teikinim. She now has to bring 2 pairs of birds. Achas lenidra v'achas lechavasa. One is because she made a special pledge. The second is because she has an obligation, like any other mother who gives birth. So she actually brings 4 birds. Remember, every woman who gives birth is obligated to bring an oila and a chatas after birth. Either it's a sheep and a bird, or it's 2 birds. But this woman decided to go the extra mile. And she says specifically, if I have a baby boy, I am making a promise to give a special contribution, a special neder. She makes a special promise that she's going to give an extra contribution, a kain, a set of birds. Now, when you contribute a set of birds to the Beis HaMikdash, simply as a pledge, it's not coming because of obligation, both of them are carbon oilus. When she brings her obligatory offering, then one is an oila, one is a chatas. But when she makes a pledge to bring an offering, that pledge doesn't include a sin offering. There's nothing about a sin. It's like a donation. It's not about a sin. So therefore, both of those birds are going to both be brought as a carbon oila. So the Mishnah says she has to bring 2 sets of birds. One to fulfill her neder, her promise, and one to fulfill her obligation, which every woman who gives birth has an obligation to bring a carbon. Nisanasam l'kayin. She gives them to the kayin. V'akayin tzarich lasas shalish pridim el ma'ilan v'achas malmatam. The kayin now has to offer 4 birds, but 3 of them he sprinkles the blood on the higher part of the altar and 1 on the lower part of the altar. Why? Because in the obligatory set of birds, 1 is an oila, so the blood goes on the higher part of the mizbech, and 1 is a chatas, the blood goes on the lower part of the mizbech. In the pledge that she offered, it's 2 birds and they're both an oila, so they both go on the higher part of the mizbech. So that's why he says 3 birds, the blood is placed on the higher part of the altar, and 1 bird, the blood is placed on the lower part of the altar. Everything is good. If the Mishnah would end here, we would be able to go to sleep very nicely this evening. Loi asakain. The problem is he didn't do this. Why didn't he do this? Presumably, as some commentators say, she came, she was in a rush, he was in a rush, she was stressed, he was stressed, I don't know what is happening. She gave him 2 sets of birds. He naturally assumed both of these are obligatory offerings. He didn't realize that one of these sets is coming because of a personal pledge she made. Maybe he thought she had twins. Maybe he thought she was bringing it on behalf of her sister-in-law or behalf of a friend of hers. He didn't realize. So what happened? So 2 of the birds, he placed the blood on top of the altar. 2 of the birds, he placed the blood on the bottom of the altar. He didn't speak to her. He didn't consult her. He did this on her own. If he would have spoken to her, he would have realized that what? That he's not doing well, because 3 of them are an oila, only 1 is a chatas, but he thought 2 of them are an oila and 2 of them are a chatas. So what happens? So now we have a problem. The problem is that one of her oilas is not good because the blood was placed on the bottom, and it's a very serious thing by karbanis. Karbanis is a very serious thing. You sanctify an animal or a bird or a meal offering, and it becomes sacred. And this is going to become something that's going to ascend to the divine, and every detail counts. how it's processed and how it's slaughtered and where the blood is placed and what you do with the animal afterwards. So here we have a serious problem. So what does she have to do? She has to bring one more bird, and this he offers on top. He places the blood on the higher part of the altar. In other words, 3 of the birds are good. 3 of the birds are good. Because remember, 3 he did on top and 1 he did on bottom. So 3 of them is good. The problem is, I'm sorry, 3 of them are good because he did 2 on top and 2 on bottom. The problem is 1 of them was disqualified because the second set of birds was brought as her personal pledge and both of them had to be done on top and he did 1 of them on bottom, remember. So therefore she has to bring another preda, another bird, and this bird is offered as her final bird as part of the set, which was her neder, her personal pledge, and of course he offers it l'mayla. This is the first mess that was created, but nish geferlich, she just brought 1 bird. This is mimin echad, of all the 4 were brought from 1 species. Now, the Mishnah intensifies the mess, and therefore the complications, and therefore the compensations. And the Mishnah now goes through a scenario where instead of having to bring 1 more bird, she'll have to bring 2 more. And then a case where she has to bring 3, and then a case where she has to bring 4, and then a case where she has to bring 5, and then a case where she has to bring 6, and then a case where she has to bring 7 new birds. Such a mess was created. The last case of this Mishnah is that she has to bring 7 new birds. Initially, she had to bring 4, 2 sets, what's called a cane and a cane. But because of the mess, and the final mess is the biggest mess, take a look at the final mess. Nisanas, a few lines later, Nisanasam lakayin. She gave her birds to the kayin, ve'en yadua ma nasna. She doesn't remember which birds she gave him. Here's the problem. The problem is she designated which species she wants to use for her pledge. She didn't just say any bird of the 2 birds, the turtle dove or the pigeon. She specified which one. She gave the birds to the kain. She doesn't remember what she gave. Now he went and he processed it, and he doesn't remember what he did. Did he sprinkle it on top? Did he sprinkle it on bottom? So there's a major, colossal mess here. She has to bring another 4 for her pledge. Another 2 for her obligation, because she specified which particular bird she wants for her pledge and she doesn't know what she gave him. So she now has to bring 4 for her pledge. Instead of 2, she has to bring another 4. And then she has to bring another 2 for her obligation. Why? Because her obligatory offerings may have also been disqualified because the kohen doesn't remember how he processed it. Did he put it on top of the mizbech? Did he put it on the bottom of the mizbech? She also has to bring another sin offering. The commentators go into detail to figure out exactly what is happening here in every single one of the scenarios. And Ben says she has to bring another 2 sin offerings, which means she has to bring another 8 birds. Wow. Now, I'm not going to go into all the calculations right now. Everybody can open up a Mesechta Kinin and take your time and your patience and learn it slowly with the commentaries. There's a different approaches to this Mishnah. There's the approach of the Bartanura, the approach of Rashi, the approach of the Rambam, the approach of Tiferes Yisrael. It's complex and it's nuanced. It's fascinating. But the bottom line here is that if you just realized how this thing evolved or devolved, the first case was the Kohen made a simple mistake, an innocent mistake, and it cost her another bird. 1 more bird. Okay, instead of 4, she brings 5. But as the mess intensifies, it's costing her more and more. And then in the grand finale of Mesechta Kinin, she's bringing 7 new birds. And according to Ben Azai, 8 new birds. Initially, she was obligated to bring 4 birds. 2 for her obligatory offering, 2 for her pledge, for her neder. Now, because of this amazing mix-up, she got mixed up, he got mixed up. They both got mixed up. If one of them got mixed up, it's also a mess. But when both of them get mixed up on every level, everything that went wrong could go wrong, basically. So she can't even bring 4. You can't say, okay, let's just start over again. Let's just bring, let's scratch this, let's bring another 4 birds, which would have made sense, right? It's not going to work. The reason your 4 birds are not going to work anymore is because she specified what species she needs to fulfill, what species she's going to bring to fulfill for her pledge. And she has to fulfill that, because if not, her pledge wasn't fulfilled, because a pledge on neder is very serious. It becomes a serious commitment in the world, and therefore she has to bring 7 new birds. But Nazai says 8. Now we come to the next stage. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua. Now here is where the Mishnah becomes absolutely, it's fascinating till now, but it's fascinating on a different level. But here the Mishnah takes a very sharp turn. And from complicated mathematical nuances and detailed, intricate halachos of how kinim work, and how an oila works, and how achatas work, and how confusions work, and how peers work, and how pledges work, the Mishnah now takes a sharp turn. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua said, Zehu she'amru. This, what you just heard in this Mishnah, this is what they said. Who's they? He doesn't say who's they. What they said. This is what they said. What did they say? They said, Keshehu chai, koiloi echad, u keshehu meis, koiloi shiva. When he is alive, he possesses one sound. When he is dead, his sound is 7-fold. Again, when he's alive, he has one sound. When he's dead, he has 7 sounds. His sound is doubled, tripled, etc., quadrupled, 7-fold. His voice, kaila is, his voice becomes 7-fold. Ketzad, kaila shiva. What do we mean by this? What do we mean when we say that his sound is 7-fold? Who are we even talking about? So as the commentators say, we're talking about a sheep. We're talking about a ram. We're talking about a beast. He doesn't say it specifically. The Rebbe suggested then in the talk that the offering of a woman when she gives birth is a sheep. Unless she's poor, she brings 2 birds. He doesn't even have to specify it. That we're talking about a sheep or we're talking about a ram, a keves. So when it's alive, it has 1 voice. When it's dead, it has 7. Ketzat kaila shiva. What do we mean by this? Says Rabbi Yehoshua. Shtei karnov. Shtei chatzotzros. The 2 horns of the ram are turned into 2 trumpets. Shtei shoykov. Shnei chalilin. The 2 leg bones are turned into 2 flutes. Oiroi, the skin, l'soif, is transformed into a drum. Meyav, the intestines, l'nevalim, are used for the strings of a lyre. A lyre is one of those stringed instruments. So he says, the hide is turned into a drum, and the intestines, the entrails, are turned into strings for the lyre. And then the Mishnah continues. B'nei meyav, l'chinoires. The large intestines are used for the strings of a harp. A kinnor is a harp. So this is what we use the large intestines for. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, this is the 7 voices. You see, when the sheep is alive, when the ram is alive, when the beast is alive, it has 1 sound. Meh. It dies, and suddenly it has 7. Let's think about this. 2 horns became 2 trumpets, that's 2. 2 leg bones, 2 thighs became 2 flutes, that's 4. The skin, the hide became a drum, that's 5. The intestines became lyres, that's 6. And the large intestines became harps, that's 7. So you took the various organs of this animal and you turned them into 7 instruments, which are producing 7 different sounds. And some say, the wool of the sheep can also be used to make tchelas. Tchelas is, of course, the turquoise color with which wool was dyed. And this is referring to, the commentators say, the robe of the Kohen Gadol, the Me'il, was made out of tchelas. It was wool taken from a sheep, sheared from a sheep, that was dyed with the turquoise color of tchelas. On the hem of the robe, there were what's called pa'amoinim, bells that would make noise, so it produced another sound. And near those bells, you had rimoinim made of tchelis, you had woolen pomegranates. They were shaped in a pomegranate, and the bells banged into them, pounded into them, and made noise. So this is another source of noise, another sound that comes from the sheep, from the wool. So we have 8. And of course, this parallels the point of view of Ben Azai, because the first opinion was that the most birds that the woman would have to bring to compensate for the mess is 7, but Ben Azai said 8. So Rabbi Yeshua says, this is what they said. When the sheep is alive, it has one voice, one sound. The sheep died, it has 7 or maybe 8. The Mishnah continues. Reb Shimon ben Akashi said, Ziknei Amaretz, old people who are Amaretz, they're ignorant. The older they get, the more they become confused. Shenemar, the verse says in Eov, Job chapter 12, Hashem removes the language of the loyal ones, and the flavor of the elderly he takes away, or the reasoning of the elderly he sometimes takes away. But elders of Torah, those who are saturated with Torah, or in the source sheet they put in Ziknei Torah, there's another version, Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim, I believe, Ziknei Torah, elders of Torah, Kolzman Shemaskinim, the older they get, their mind becomes more settled. Shenemar, it says in Eov chapter 12, B'yeshishim chachma, in old age there's wisdom, v'oirech yamim tvuna, and in the length of days there is understanding. And this concludes Mesechta Kinin and the entire Seder Kachim, which we learn to Seder Taras. What is the point of these last 2 statements in the Mishnah? What does it mean? So the commentators explain. If you look up Rabbeinu Ovadia of Bartanura, the classic commentary on the Mishnah, the Rav, the Bartanura, or you look in the commentary of Rambam on Mishnayos and other commentators, their point is as follows. Rabbi Yeshua is trying to give us an explanation, and he says, this is such a strange phenomenon. The strange phenomenon is what? A woman wanted to bring 4 birds, and she ends up bringing 7 or 8. How do you make sense out of this? Rabbi Yeshua said, this is what they said. When the sheep was alive, it produced one sound. Meh. When it died, you would think that sound would be over. It's dead. Suddenly, it produces 7 sounds. This woman, initially, when she brought her offerings and she made the pledge, she had to bring 2 sets of birds, only 4. Right? Now there's a mess, there's a confusion. It's like when the sheep dies, everything gets confused, everything changes. And what happens? There's many more sounds. There's many more voices. There's many more birds that are brought. There's 7 birds. There's 8 birds. Just like the sheep after it's dead has 7 sounds or 8 sounds that come from the instruments that are fashioned from the various organs of the sheep. Or as the Rambam puts it, when the sheep dies and essentially deteriorates, it loses its value, it's dead. Nisraba by ha-mitzvahs. Suddenly you could do so many more mitzvahs with it because you can take the various parts and make trumpets out of them, shofars out of them, various musical instruments that would play in the Beis HaMikdash or at other wonderful occasions and actually fulfill mitzvahs with these instruments. As a result of the sheep's death, if the ram wouldn't die, you could never do it. So the Rambam says, as a result of the deterioration, now you can have a shofar for Rosh Hashanah, you can have a trumpet for the Beis HaMikdash, you can have a shofar for the Beis HaMikdash, you can have a drum in the Beis HaMikdash, a harp, a lyre. These were all instruments that were used in the Beis HaMikdash on a daily level for the musical concertos that the Levium would conduct in the Beis HaMikdash. The Kohen Gadol can have a robe with pomegranates, all because the ram has died. Here too, as a result of the mess, as a result of the confusion, we have so many more birds that have brought us karbanis. What's the connection with the last piece? Elderly Amei Aretz, Ziknei Amaretz, Ziknei Torah, what's the connection? Same point, says the Bartanura. When the sheep died, what happened? The sounds increased. Mute yourself. I gotta mute themselves. The sheep died, what happened? More voices, more sounds. A person gets older, what happens? Their body deteriorates. People get weaker. So he says, those who are Amei Aretz, who are ignoramus, indeed, they become weaker and their minds become weaker. But the sages of Torah, what happens? Even though you would expect them to become more feeble because of their physical weakness, what happens? Their wisdom grows. Here too. As the situation becomes more complicated and more problematic, like the person getting older and older, you would expect a decline. What happens? The woman ends up bringing 7 more offerings, or according to Ben Azai, 8 more offerings. Okay. This is the basic classic understanding of this fascinating Mishnah at the end of Mesechta Kinin. I hope it's clear, at least on some level. Now, let's go to the Sicha itself. Please go to the Sicha itself. We had the source sheet, so now go to the top. And let's go to the Sicha itself. If you go to the source sheets, again, page 1, 2, 3. If you go to theyeshiva.net, you can open your source sheets. It's page 131, third page when you start scrolling down from the source sheet. You see Tazria Beis, there's a star, and it says V'siyah Mesechta Kinin V'seder Kachim. Now, the first seif we just did, so I'm not going to do it again. He basically quotes the Mishnah, the whole Mishnah, till the end, and he quotes the commentators who explain what the Mishnah means, which I just went through with you inside the Mishnah. I want to go to the next page, Seif Beis. Seif Beis begin the questions. The Lubavitcher Rebbe's classic questions on this Mishnah, very, very powerful questions, which teach you how to learn a Mishnah. Beis. According to the above, we really have to understand something. Aleph, number 1. Auf dem Minyan as Melachatchil is given menit wie ein Sach. Und dafke durch Kilkel v'kayetze b'zeh werden 7 Sachen, kann man geben kama v'kama Dugmoyes. Wie Lamoschen. A Dugma Pschutte von der Chassim, was gehen über bei Yerusha von dem Vater, zu 7 oder 8 Jöschen. Kols Mann, der Meirisch lebt, gehören den Chassim zu ein Mensch. Kusho Meis, und die Kinder jahrschen den Chassim, gehören den Chassim zu 7 oder 8 Menschen. Meile kommt in dem zu Ribu, und euch in Mitzvahs, das ist aber bei Mitzvahs. Aber so der Chiyuv, Mitzvahs Peye, Bikurim, V'chuli. If jeder Chelik Asada was aufeinander geteilt geworden zu jeder Basunder. Bedungen wir wieder über Kabbanis, but they will let us. Von dem, was Rabbi Yeshua bringt, dafke die Dugme, ist moving as in der Dugme ist da ein Teuchen, was ist Massen bei Jösser, leniden de dan, mehr wie andere Dugmeis. Rabbi said, I don't understand. You're looking for some type of concrete illustration that there was one entity, and through a mess, through a deteriorating process, it went from 1 to 7 or 8. You can give so many examples. And he says, take the most concrete example of assets. A father is alive, and all of his assets and all of his money belong to whom? To one person. He passes away, and what happens? If he has 7 children, he has 7 heirs. Now, the same property belongs to 7 people. Ownership gets increased by 7-fold. Instead of one person owning the property, now you have 7 people owning the property. Now you have 7 opinions. Now you have 7 people involved. Now suddenly there's 7 people who got it. And what does that mean? So you say, okay, but it's not connected. Here there's new carbonas. He says, no. So a lot of new things happen. There's a lot of ribui. There's 7 or maybe 8 people, if there's 8 children or 7 children, or as many children as there are. They can all be doing different types of things, and there's also many more mitzvahs. Why? Because as long as the father had all this property, so he had mitzvah on him, whatever the mitzvahs were. But now every child who is an heir has his own obligation in all of the mitzvahs connected to property. For example, when you have a field, you have a mitzvah of payah. The corner of the field you have to leave for the poor. You have a mitzvah of bikurim, the new fruits that grow from the 7 species with which Eretz Yisrael was praised. You have to fill up a basket with them and bring them to Yerushalayim and give them to the Kohen. And all of the other mitzvahs, whether you're dealing with trumas and maasros, there's so many mitzvahs that are connected to agriculture. Before it was one mitzvah on one person. Now it's 7 different mitzvahs on each child who has his own field. So if you had one huge field, you now divided the field. So if you had one, let's say one big field, right? So the field had one mitzvah of payah, one mitzvah of bikurim. Now you divided the field into 7 different properties. So now everyone has their own mitzvah of payah, their own mitzvah of bikurim, just like by the woman who gave birth, by the Yeledes. As the situation apparently became more messy, she now has many more mitzvahs. It seems like Rabbi Yeshua finds a very interesting example of a sheep or a ram whose voice, whose sound was 1 and suddenly became 7. It seems like there's something about this illustration that is more appropriate than any other example. But what is it? If it's just the idea that when situations become worse, they often increase, there's new opportunity, and there's things that are added and things that are increased, you can bring other examples. That's number 1. V'tzarech lahavin, was is the teichen? Now, the aim leimer at the Mishnah bringt nicht die Dugma von Yerusha, weil bei Kinem ist nicht taken Shinu in der Kabbanis, was sie hat Friege darf bringen. Sie ist noch Meisef allein. Maschenken bei Yerusha is the Meirish bottle. Warum echt bei Keves is bottle the Kelf the Keves beseret gelebt. You can say maybe the Mishnah needs to bring this example because an inheritance wouldn't work. You know why? Because by Kinem, by the birds, there's no change in the offerings that she had to bring. She just has to add. In other words, by Yerusha, the original one is gone. By Kinim, there's no change in the offerings that she had to bring. She just has to add more. The originals remain. Here, it's gone. The Meirish is bottled, but by the Kevis is the same thing. The sheep is also gone. That original voice is gone. When a sheep dies, there's no man anymore. It's substituted into new sounds. Now, you might want to say, the reason he didn't want to bring an example from Yerusha is because the father is gone, he passes away. And now the children take over. The original one is not there anymore. So it's not like Kinim. Because by Kinim, it's not like she passed away, chas v'shalom. It means there's no change in the karbanos that she had to bring. She had to bring, but now she brings more. She adds to them. In fact, some of them may have been kosher. In fact, maybe in some cases it may have worked out. We just don't know. But if that's the case, the sheep is also not a good example because that original sheep is gone. Beis. Wenn man bringt a Dugma und a Moschel, das bechder soll zukommen in Havanas Hadavar. Und befragt benitten de Dan, wie der Rambam sagt, mit Pnei Shahaya Inyan Zor, der Pfarr bringt Rabbi Yeshua der Moschel Shu Daimel Masham Keves. Ist nicht moving. Was hat Teisves Havana kommt zu in der Minyan durch dem, was man sagt, we don't just bring, especially in Mishnayos, you don't just bring parables to entertain people. You learn Mishnayos, you'll see. That's not what happens. If a parable or an allegory or a metaphor is brought, it's in order to make it palpable, to make it understandable, fathomable, to bring it down to a person's mind. The Rambam says right here in his commentary, the Rambam in Mishnayos says that the concept was strange, so Rabbi Yeshua felt the need to illustrate it. The Rebbe says, granted, but where do you get more understanding from this parable of a sheep? It's very interesting to think about the fact that the sheep died and its organs are turned into musical instruments and one sound became 7, one voice became 7 voices, one sound became 7 sounds, granted. But how does that give us an explanation or a deeper or clearer understanding in this very concept? Which means that apparently the parable is not serving a purpose. What's the purpose? Gimel. From Parshas Lashon Rabbi Yeshua, Zeu Shamru, Unit Kimoy Shamru, Lema Hadover Dem V'Keitzim, says Mashma, as it is nit nor mevayer dem Inyan von Kinem Shebe Mishnah. Nor euch ve'adrabe, Mit dem Dinnen Kinin wird Musber Masham noch Shul Chai Kele Yechad. V'lechaira, der Inyan von Shul Chai Kele Yechad, Shul Meis Kele Shiva, ist ein einfacher Inyan Tivi, und man darf auf dem kein Asbar nicht haben. It's a very interesting question. The language of Rabbi Yeshua is, this is what they said. When a sheep is alive, it has one sound. When it dies, its sound becomes sevenfold. He doesn't say, like they said about the sheep. Or let me give an example from the sheep. He says, this is what they said about the sheep. It sounds like he's not only trying to explain our Mishnah in Kinin, he's also trying to explain the statement about the sheep. You understand? If he would have said, let me give you a metaphor. When a sheep is alive, it has one sound. When it dies, it has seven. Okay. So he's giving a parable to explain the Mishnah in Kinin. But the language of Rabbi Yeshua is, Zeu sha'amru, this is what they said. It's almost like, now you'll understand what they said. Zeu, this is the meaning of what they said. Now, you'll understand what they said. It's almost, it seems like he's trying to explain also, and maybe even more, what they said about the sheep, as though that's the focus. So obviously, what is he trying to explain here? Statements of somebody who said something? Who's the one who said this? That's what the Rebbe said at the beginning. Who is the person who said this statement? And Rabbi Yeshua feels that now my job is to explain what that guy said. Whoever said it, whoever was the author of that comment about the sheep, I have to explain it. And let me tell you, now we understand it. But the truth is, the basic question is what he asks here is, you don't need an explanation. It's part of nature. And it's a very obvious and self-understood reality. When a sheep dies, it's dead, it's lifeless. But its organs are used into instruments, and suddenly one sound became seven. I get it. It's a fascinating natural phenomenon. Doesn't need an explanation. So Rabbi Yeshua says, Zeu shamru. This is the pshat was gesagt. Zeu. This is was gesagt about a kever. As though we have to explain this statement about a sheep. Oich. Also, and now the Rebbe is going to add what I just said a moment ago. Since when is it the mission statement of Mishnayos or Torah generally to give explanations on statements said by people in the world? So somebody made such a statement about a sheep. It's a very interesting statement. Let's say it is a very complex statement and it needs explanation. Is this the function of Mishnayos? To start explaining what people say about sheep? So we have three questions. Muzman sagen, as mit Ksho Chai, meint Rabbi Yeshua nicht stam sagen am Maschel von Amayim mit Eulam, nor an Inyan was in der Gele Din v'Halacha. Und das meint der Bishne Zehu Sha'amru. As the Bier in der Halacha was kommt reis von Amayim Ksho Chai, net men a reis von dem Din in unser Mishnah mit der Kabbanas was die Yeledes bringt. When Rabbi Yeshua said this, he didn't just mean to give a parable from something that's said in the world. He's actually saying something that's relevant to halacha. And that's what he means. Zeu sha'amru. The explanation in the halacha about a sheep and the difference between a live sheep and a dead sheep, you can take out, you can deduce from the halacha in Mesechta Kinin about the offerings of a mother after she gave birth. So to summarize Seif Beis, summation. Question number one is, why not just give a simpler example of a father who died and his inheritance got split up and increased, and from one owner there are 7 owners with many more mitzvahs. Number two, a parable is here to explain, to illustrate, to add understanding. Where do we gain, where do we glean more understanding through this parable? Okay, the sheep died and there's 7 sounds. Granted, 7 musical instruments between the trumpets and the drum and the lyre and the harp. Granted. How does that really explain what happened here? The woman forgot what she did. The kohen forgot what he did. There's a colossal mess and she has to bring 7 new birds. Will you give me explanation? Now, most people, when they learn the Mishnah, they don't have these questions. You know why? Why not? Okay, it's a metaphor. Weitergegangen. The Rebbe says, that's not how you learn a Mishnah. That's not how you learn a Mishnah. The Mishnah is not here just to tell stories, to entertain people, to put you to sleep with stories. Every word in Mishnah is meticulous and precise. There's a geder here, there's a vart here, there's a yisoid here that's being conveyed. What is it? Third question is, Rabbi Yeshua's language intimates that he's not just explaining our Mishnah, he's also interested in explaining the story of the sheep that died, as though it's some sacred story. Some children's story that somebody made up, that when a sheep died and suddenly 7 sounds, it's a very natural phenomenon. That's what he wants to explain. Zeu sheyamru, this is what they said. It's almost like this statement is some sacred old tradition from the days of yore that was passed down by some of the greats. Where does this come from? It's a statement. Who said it? No Tana said it. No Tana said it. No Pasuk said it. No Navi said it. It's a Maimer. The Welt sagt, in Yiddish they say, the Welt sagt, a Maimer Oilem. The world says, it's okay, man. It's one of those quotable quotes. Geschmack. I have no issue with quotable quotes. But it's like, Zeu Shamru. This is what they said. First of all, it doesn't explain our Mishnah. Second of all, it seems like he wants to explain that quote. But you don't have to explain that quote. The quote is very obvious. It makes sense. You don't have to explain it. And even if you did, is this the job of Mishnayos? Is this the job of Rabbi Yeshua? Is this the job of Torah? By the way, when the Rebbe asked the question, he added, the Gemara says Rabbi Yeshua was Chachimoi de Yehudai. He was considered the wisest Jew of the day. In fact, all of the major debates against the philosophers of non-Jewish philosophers of the time were conducted by Rabbi Yeshua. There's a whole sugya Meseches Chagiga Daf Hey, and a big sugya Meseches B'choros Daf Ches. The great debate between Rabbi Yeshua, Stam Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. By the way, Rabbi Yeshua was a Levi. He served as a Levi at the end of the era of the second Beis Hamikdash. So he knew about the musical instruments. I just thought about this. He knew about the musical instruments in the Beis Hamikdash because he would sing or he would play music. He was a musician or a vocalist, but he was a Levi who was in the Beis Hamikdash. He was one of the Meshayrim. The Gemara says, Stam Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. And he was there at the Churban, and he was a great debater. He debated the sages of Athens, Savi de Beasuna, 60 sages of Athens, the Greek philosophers during the Roman era. So Rabbi Yeshua was a brilliant man. So the Rebbe said that. Rabbi Yeshua is not just coming here to tell us little stories or give us cute metaphors. Rabbi Yeshua was saying something. There's profound, any Tana, but certainly Rabbi Yeshua, Chachimoi de Yehudai. So what do we have to learn? What do we have to say here? Rabbi Yeshua is not just telling us statements and giving us explanations. Zeu sha'amru, what they said is not the pestam somebody said it. There's something of halacha that's being said here. Zehu sha'amru. Now you'll understand what they said. And this halacha comes out from our Mishnah. But what? What is it? Very hard to understand. It's not clear. Next step. Gimel, weiter ist die Mishnah Mamshech, Reb Shimon ben Akashioim, Mezikne Amoritz, Kol Zman Shei Maskinim, Daita mit Ereves Alem, Shnei Mesis Afel Neman mit Am Skenim Yikoch, Aval Zikne, Teirene Kein, Al Kol Zman Shei Maskinim, Daita mit Ereves Alem, Shnei Mesis Afel Neman mit Am Tvuna, und die Scheiches La Koid, mit der Geshem Shomeis Koil Shiva Kach Zikne, Teire Kol Zman Shei Maskinim, Bom de Gashos Koich, Mesif Chochma. We already said this. The last part of the Mishnah is about the different types of people who get old. Those who are Amiratzim, they are ignorant, and those who are saturated with Torah. And the connection is that even when they get old, Talmidei Chachamim, men and women of Torah, even when they get old and they become weak, their wisdom only increases. Medaf Abba Fashtain asks the Lubavitcher Rebbe Aleph, was ist da bechal negederin von Ziknei Amoritz kol zman shem askinim chuli? Beis, my kamashmel, and this is the svara pshuta v'rishoina, as tashus koyach breng tashus chochma. Gimel v'yiseidim is a. So he's hepech kavonas hamadu b'mishnah b'smichus laza. Zum madger sein, as dafke durch Ziknei v'boim tashus koyach, kommt zu in chochma daled, al kol ponem et das gedav zagen la'achere von dem chiddish and the baba von Ziknei Teure, as afal pivos by zeis niteisev b'yishuv daitem is havche by Ziknei Amoritz. Gewaldige 4 questions the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked. Question number 1. Why are you putting in here the negative, that ignorant people, the older they get, the more confused their mind gets? What's the point? That's not the theme you're trying to convey, so scratch it. Delete that part. What do you need it for? As the Rebbe said it in the Fabrengen, generally the Torah avoids speaking disgracefully about people. Even about animals, the Gemara says in Baba Basra, Kuf Chav Gimel, the beginning of Psachim, full of begnus behemoth tmeila dibur akasav. We don't even like to speak negatively about an unkosher animal. That's just an addition in parentheses, but it's not relevant here. Why are you talking about elderly people who are Amei Haaretz that their mind gets confused? Number one. Number two, what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? Everybody knows as people get older and they get weaker, it affects their mental capacity. Physical strength and physical decline and decline in a person's health, and a person becomes weaker, it affects also their intellectual keenness and acuteness and sharpness. It's unfortunately, it's part of the natural phenomenon of aging. So he says, my kamashma, what's the chiddush? First of all, why is it relevant here? Why are you inserting it here? And second of all, it's obvious. When people get older, they become more confused. Things change. The body changes and the brain changes. I mean, we all know this. Question number 3. It's opposite of what you're trying to bring out. The Mishnah is trying to bring out how precisely through the decline there is an increase. Through the mess that happened in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohen forgot, the woman forgot, there's more karbanos. So how do you bring that out? By telling me that Talmidei Chachamim, the older they get, the wiser they get. Beautiful. When you tell me about Ziknei Amei Haaretz, it's the exact opposite point. The older you get, the less it gets, not the more it gets. And number 4, even if you want to say it, because you want to contrast it, say it at the end. The main point is, Reb Shimon ben Akashya, it should have said like this, Reb Shimon ben Akashya, Ziknei Torah, the older they get, the more their mind becomes settled. And then, even if you feel the need to contrast, which is also doesn't seem necessary, you could say afterwards. And by the way, Ziknei Haaretz is the opposite, because that's your point. Your point is Ziknei Torah. Your point is not Ziknei Haaretz. It's very strange. 4 big questions of the Rebbe. We're going to get into the explanation. Now, before that, I'm going to tell you a cute story. I was once invited to speak at a very big event in Eretz Yisrael in Israel. They told me that I'm going to go up at 10 o'clock. There were maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people there. This was in Kfar Chabad. And I was supposed to go up at 10 o'clock. I came there. I was waiting. But every few minutes, another dignitary was coming, and they had to give him the mic. You had members of the Knesset, members of the Israeli parliament, upstanding and famous celebrities and politicians and ministers. So they kept on coming in. So they kept on giving them the mic and delaying my speech further and further. The Rav of Kfar Chabad at the time was a Jew named Hagon Reb Motel Ashkenazi, Reb Mordechai Ashkenazi, Zechrona Livracha. I guess he noticed that I was somewhat upset. So he called me over and he said, let me tell you a story. And this is the story that Rabbi Ashkenazi shared with me. He said there was once a rabbinic conference. This is pre-Second World War. And there were 2 rabbinic figures at the conference. The first was the Rogatchover Gaon, Sarah Torah, Rabbeinu Yosef Rosen, who passed away in 1936, Tainus Esther, Yud Aleph Adar, Tainus Esther Mukdam, was one of the greatest minds in many, many generations. The Rogatchover Gaon, he was there. And there was another rabbi there who was more modernized, more what we would call progressive halachically, and his scholarship did not come anywhere close to the Rogatchover, nor did his spiritual integrity come close to the Rogatchover. The question was, who's going to address the conference first? So this rabbi, understanding the greatness of the Rogatchover Gaon, told the Rogatchover, Rebbe, you speak first. The Rogatchover said, no, you speak first. He said, why do I get the honor of speaking before the Rogatchover? So the Rogatchover told him as follows. Rogatchover was very sharp. He was not diplomatic. He said as follows. It's based on a Mishnah in Kinin. Ziknei Amei Haaretz calls man shei maskinim daitem et harefes aleim. Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim calls man shei maskinim daitem es yasheves aleim. Ignorant people, the older they get, the more confused they get. Torah scholars, the older they get, the wiser they get. So he says as follows. You are an Am Haaretz. The longer we delay your speech, the older you're going to get. The more your mind will become confused. the more stupidity will come out of your mouth. He says, by me, it's the opposite. If we delay my speech, I'm going to get a little older. My mind will become more settled. I'll have what to say better than what I had to say before. This is what the Rabbi Jacobson told this person. So Rabbi Ashkenazi tells me, he says, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, it's a compliment. They're delaying your speech later and later because they trust that the older you get, the more settled you become, and the words that will emerge afterwards will be even better and wiser and deeper and more authentic than the words that were said earlier. It was a very nice way to calm me down, and indeed I went up very, very late, I think after midnight or close to midnight. Dalet, the nekudas habir b'cholzeh. Here is the key of the explanation. What does the Rebbe want to do now? The Rebbe is now going to go to the core of the Mishnah. There's the mathematics of the Mishnah. There's the nuances of the Mishnah, the intricacies of the Mishnah. But now we have to go to the core of the Mishnah, what you call nekudas hatamtzas, the quintessence of the Mishnah. What's the real point here of the Mishnah? And when we can get to that, we'll understand what Rabbi Yeshua is telling us. For dem din von kinem kumt areis a chidush inyan. This whole Mishnah about the confusion with the birds brings us and brings out a tremendous novel idea. Be'etzem likta fayeledes achiyuv kein echad. Echad loylev echad lechatas. Ubenidden de dan likta if euch de chiyuv nidre stei predes loyle. Excuse me. Mitzad de Tosen und Zweikes was werden geschaffen bei der Ische bei dem Koyen. Kommt areis achiyuv von kamme ve kamme karbones bis zu Shiva oder Shmeina. Men is mechayev bringen karbones neusafim zum makriv sein bei Samikdash. Beshas es kann sein, als sie sind nicht mechayev. Und die karbones was in sie mechayev, hat man schon makriv gewähnt. Und sie ist schöne Schappe geworden und jetzt gewähnt kalachiv shalom. Vahashar chulin ba'azara bishleima. I'm going to explain in a moment. Bishleima chata sa'oivas kumt ef asafik ba'asafik ilades v'kayetze b'zeh. Yeshleimar kepashtas halimud in Gemara as the Teirat mechadash given. As afilu ef asafik ibnitma is it chayev akarban lekapara. Was is mati lechel bekatshim. Bedugma vi anashim tali. But the Teirat mechayev given bringen b'shas is asafik im chata. V'zeu hanikra asham tali shu mechaper al asafik v'teileloi atshi yevodaloi bevadei shechata b'shgaga. Aber benidden dann ist doch der Chiyuv mit Chila vadozdik. Und der Safik kommt zu der Nach vayidei ha'isha va'akayin. Sie hat Maschel gewen in der Safa auf dem Chiyuv v'nischaper lo. Euch, was ageder haben die 7 oder 8 Karbones. B'shas the Sibbe von Zeir HaKrava is a Safik shel ha'isha oy ha'kayin. There is a fundamental issue here that Rabbi Yeshua is trying to address. A woman who gives birth needs to bring 2 birds if she's poor. One for Oila, one for Chatas. In this case, she has to bring another 2 birds as a carbon Oila because she made a special pledge. However, something happened. There were mistakes. Those mistakes created doubts. These mistakes and doubts were created through the errors of the woman, of the mother, and the Kayan. And because of that, this woman is now obligated to bring many new offerings to the point that she may bring one, she may have to bring 1 more, 2 more, or 3 more, or 4 more, or 5 more, or 6 more, or maybe even 7 more. And according to Ben Azza, there's a possibility that she has to bring 8 new birds as karbanas. Now, this is no simple thing. You're obligating a Jew to bring many new offerings in the Beis HaMikdash when it's possible that she's not obligated to bring them. Because we're not sure about what happened. It's possible in many of the cases in the Mishnah, it's possible that she actually fulfilled her obligation, or she fulfilled part of her obligation. And the offerings that she was really obligated in, she may have offered them and fulfilled what she had to fulfill. And if you go through the Mishnah, you'll see how many levels of doubts there are. There are doubts on doubts on doubts, so it's possible that she already fulfilled everything she had to fulfill, and she received all the atonement that she received, which in a regular case, if you just bring an unnecessary offering, it's called chulin ba'azara. You're bringing a mundane animal, you're offering it as a carbon into the Beis HaMikdash, which is an absolute no-no. It's an absolute transgression. In this case, of course, the halacha tells you to do it. But the phenomenon here is a very, very nuanced and complex one and strange one. She's bringing 7 new birds, maybe 8 new birds. According to Ben Azai, it's 8. According to the first Tana, it's 7. Or even 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 additional birds. And all based on doubts, based on her mistakes, based on the Kohen's mistakes. They didn't notice, they forgot, they were overwhelmed, they were startled, whatever, they didn't realize, they were not cognizant, they were not focused. And because of that, you're obligating her to bring all of these karbanas. Now, he makes it clear, the Rebbe makes it clear. There are karbanas that you bring based on a doubt. For example, a woman may have a miscarriage early on, and we're not sure if this was a miscarriage of a fetus, or maybe she discharged something else. And the Gemara learns out, as he brings in the footnotes, that the Torah says that even if there's a doubt if she discharged a fetus or not, there is an obligation to bring a carbon. Because there's a suffix tumah, there's a doubt if she's tummy or not tummy, because whenever you have a baby, there's a tumah, and then you have to bring a carbon to go into the Beis HaMikdash, and here it's a suffix. So the Torah says, for this suffix, for this doubt, you bring a carbon. Since it's a suffix tumah, you also bring a carbon, and afterwards you can go to the Beis HaMikdash and you can eat karbanas, just like there's a case of an asham tali. An asham tali means there's certain sins that if a Jew did them by mistake, inadvertently he has to bring a carbon. It's called a carbon chatas. But what if you're not sure if you did this sin by mistake? It's an asham tali. For example, there's 2 pieces of meat near you, okay? One is shuman, one is chaylev. One is the fat of a kosher animal. The other one is also the fat of a kosher animal, but it's the parts of the fat that you're not allowed to eat. You're not allowed to eat it. Now you ate one of these 2. Maybe they looked identical. They're both fatty, but you don't remember. You don't know which one you ate. So you're not sure, you have to bring a carbon chatas, because if you ate the kosher meat, you're good. But if you ate the chaylev, you would have to bring a carbon chatas. But here you're not sure. So you bring a special carbon called an asham tali. And the Torah says it. Until you find out for sure that you sinned, then you'll bring a carbon chatas. But at this point, it's called an asham tali, a suspended asham. An asham of when you are in a limbo state, when you're hanging tali, it's suspended. So here the Torah initially says that even though it's a doubt, you're bringing the carbon for a doubt. That's fine. The Torah here creates a type of carbon that is carved out from a doubt. But here that's not what happened. It's not that there was a doubt if the woman was obligated. So the Torah says, okay, bring a carbon. No. Here the obligation was absolutely certain. There's a woman who had a baby. She had to bring a pair of birds. She pledged a second pair of birds. The problems happened later. The obligation was a vada. It was an absolute obligation. She had to bring an offering. Because of the error of the kohen and of the woman, later this certain absolute set of karbanas turns into such a complicated situation. And now we don't know what's going on. We don't know if she fulfilled her obligation completely, if she fulfilled her obligation partially, if she did not fulfill her obligation at all. We don't know if she had her atonement, if she didn't have her atonement. And yet, our sages tell us what has to happen. She starts all over again. And not she starts all over again and brings another 4. No, she brings 4, maybe she brings 5, 6, 7, 8. This is a very unique phenomenon in halacha. In addition to that, how do we define these 7 or 8 karbanas? They were caused by a suffix. They were caused by a doubt in the woman's mind or in the kohen's mind or in both of their minds. So on one hand, you can say that there's an absolute obligation to bring a carbon. There may not be. On the other hand, you can say there's no obligation to bring a carbon because then it's chulin bazari, you're not allowed to do it. So these karbanas are very limbo-like karbanas. What are they? Are they certain obligations? Are they not certain obligations? Are they obligations based on a doubt, but the doubt came from something that was absolute and certain? So you're dealing here with a mess within a mess. How do you define all of these karbanas? So the Chazal understood that she has to bring these karbanas. And they said, you have to go and bring another bird or 2 birds or 3 birds or 4 birds in order to fulfill your obligation. But this is a gewaldige chiddush, that there was an absolute prescribed set of laws that she has to do. she and the Kohen messed up because of their mistakes, which is part of being human. We make mistakes. That's being human. It's part of our vulnerability. And what happens suddenly? Oh, Gewalt. You're not just repeating the process again. You're now bringing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 new birds. 8. That's double of the amount that you had to bring initially. And we don't even know if you're obligated fully, or maybe, again, there were mistakes and the Kohen doesn't remember and she doesn't remember. Maybe everything was done right. The last case, everything couldn't have been done right, but maybe a lot of things were done right. This is what Rabbi Yeshua needs to explain. If Dem Zok Rabbi Yeshua has to say something. What does he say? He says something very profound. He's not just telling you a cute parable about taking a sheep and taking the limbs and turning them into instruments, which is a beautiful lesson in school to teach children and adults how to make musical instruments and how to make use out of everything in the world, and how everything, this is an incredible thing, how even an animal after it dies, it doesn't just die, it always gains, it gives something to the world. Every creature gives and takes, every creature. And even when an animal dies, its fossils return back to the soil or are absorbed by another animal, and it becomes part of the incredible food chain and food web, and becomes part of the incredible balanced ecosystem which allows our planet to continue to live and flourish. And that's a fascinating phenomenon of nature, how Hashem built the world, that everything gives and takes, and even after death there is a continuous process of give and take. That's beautiful, and it's an incredible insight, but it doesn't belong in Mishnayos Mesechta Kinin. If Dem Zok Rabbi Yeshua, Zeu Sha'amru Ksho Chai Koile Yechad Uksho Meis Koile Shiva. V'lechayde is das Tarti Desasri. The words of Rabbi Yeshua are extremely significant, and you have to hear those words. They seem poetic, and they are, but they're also halachic. They seem poetic, but they're also halachic. Rabbi Yeshua says, this is what it meant when they said that when the beast is alive, it possesses one sound. When it's dead, its sound becomes sevenfold. Its sound becomes sevenfold? Meh gets increased sevenfold? No. The meh is dead. Meh is dead. The sheep is unfortunately gone, lifeless. The instruments are fashioned from 7 organs. But listen to the words of Rabbi Yeshua. HaKeshohu chai koiloi echod. His coil, its sound is one. It possesses one sound. Kshohu meis koiloi shiva. Its sound, the sound of the keves, becomes 7. Is this poetry? Is this science? Is this nature? What does Rabbi Yeshua say? What do you mean its sound becomes 7? No, its sound is muted forever. The sheep is gone. The beast is gone. The ram is gone. Obviously, talking about a sheep that has horns. So it's the male ram. Because you're turning the horns into trumpets, into shofars, into horns. You're taking horns and turning them. So you have to have an animal that has horns. But he doesn't actually say which animal. So you could say it's a ram, because a ram is the family of the sheep, and the sheep is what the woman brings as a carbon, if she's not poor. Okay. I'm just responding to a question somebody asks. Would he have horns? It's not talking about a baby sheep or female. We're talking about a sheep that grows and has horns, obviously, which we call a ram. An ayil. What does he mean? Koiloi Shiva. Koiloi. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe sees in this expression the key word. This is the key word. Let's see inside. There's a contradiction here. The Shiva Koilas einen Stei Karnov, Stei Chatzoitzres, was einen Koilas von Karnayim, Scheukim, Chuli, was haben nicht kein Scheiches zum Koiloi von Keves, va'afal bekein Amnuk shehu meis Koiloi Shiva. There's a paradox here. Because the 7 sounds are horns, which become trumpets. Hide, which becomes a drum. Intestines, which becomes a lyre. Large intestines, which becomes a harp. Pomegranates. Wool, which becomes pomegranates. on the robe which has bells. These are sounds of horns, of thighs, of leg bones, of intestines. These are not the sounds of the sheep itself. Says Rabbi Yeshua, no, this is what they said. When the sheep dies, when the beast dies, when the ram dies, koiloi shiva, alidei misas hakeves, werd bottel der koiloi echod, und sie werden neue koilois bekarnayim chuli, aber amru, as sie sind alle koiloi von dem keves. The death of the sheep indeed obliterates that single sound, the voice of the sheep. There are new sounds, very different sounds. You can't compare the sounds of the horns, the sounds of the trumpets, or the sound of the drum, or the sound of the harp or the lyre, with the sound of the sheep when it's alive. But Amru, Zeusha Amru, this is what they said. Koiloi, it's all the sound, it's all the voice, it's the koil of the keves. This is what they said. There's a depth in what they said. It's the sheep's sound being manifested, metamorphosized, transformed, filtered, but ultimately manifested, conveyed, expressed through these 7 organs, through these 7 instruments. Each instrument captures in its own unique way, in its own unique shape, color, flavor, through its own unique characteristics, the koil hakeves. Physically, doesn't mean physically that when you're listening to a trumpet that's made from the horn of a ram, or you're listening to the shofar and Rosh Hashanah, you're listening to a sheep crying, or a sheep pleading, or a sheep expressing itself. Meh. But on some deep symbolic level, that's what's happening. Because it's ultimately from the sheep. It's all the power of the sheep. It's the qualities, it's the features, it's the characteristics that God embedded in the genetic and physiological makeup of a sheep. It's the koil keves that's coming out, even though the keves is dead. The ram was slaughtered, the ram is gone. The ram has no koil. But this is the koil keves that's coming out through these. The sheep is gone, the sheep is dead. There's new sounds, yes. But kishahu meis koiloi shiva. It's koiloi. We attribute it back to the sheep. We have to have the wisdom. We have to have the gratitude. We have to be able to remember the source. Remember the progenitor. Remember where it comes from. Shma b'ni musar avicha al titesh teiris imecha. These sounds have a mother. These voices have a father. These sounds come from somewhere. Don't take the trumpet for granted. Don't take the harp for granted. Don't take the lyre for granted. Don't take the bells for granted. They come from somewhere. The sheep gave up its life for you to be able to enjoy the harp, for you to be able to enjoy the lyre. Hallelujah, b'nevel v'chinor. Navel is a lyre. Chinor is a sharp. You say in the morning, hallelujah. Hallelujah, b'seika shofar. That's the shofar. The ram's horn comes from the ram. Hallelujah, b'seika shofar. Hallelujah, b'nevel. The lyre comes from the ram. Hallelujah, b'chinor. B'nevel v'chinor. The harp, it comes from the lyre. David HaMelech would play the music. David HaMelech was a brilliant musician. And the Gemara says in Brachas Daf Gimel, there was a harp on top of the bed of David HaMelech. Midnight, the wind would sway the harp. It would begin playing music. David HaMelech would wake up and learn Torah the whole night. Kinar, the Ben Yayada says, is Neir Chavav. It's the Neir of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Every musical instrument has such drama, such depth, such beauty. Don't take for granted that the sheep gave up its life. This is the koil keves. This is the sound of the keves that's coming out. I know it's a new sound. It went through a major metamorphosis. This is a very, very powerful and also emotional idea we're going to see. Now the Rebbe is dealing with it from a completely halachic perspective, not from an emotional or historical perspective. At the end of the Sicha, it's going to all be seen through the lenses of history, through the lens of history, and through the lens of spiritual vision of Judaism, how we view history, how we view the evolution of history from generation to generation, the relationship of a mother to a child, from a father to a child, from grandparents to grandchildren. But here we're talking about the halachic revolutionary statement of Rabbi Yeshua, Koiloi Shiva, Zehu Sha'amru. Der mit is mavur, der geder von die Karbonas. Als Chotsch die Sibbe von der Karbonas seinen Zweikes, wo seinen geschaffen geworden, la'achere, ide erste Karbonas chayva, seinen euch die Karbonas bedugmas koiloi. Sie haben auf sich a geder chayva v'chuli. Punkt wie die erste Karbonas ihre. Here we have the halachic, lamdische definition of all these 7 new birds this woman is bringing. True, the reason she has to bring all these new offerings are because of the doubts that were created after she brought the first 4 offerings. Those 4 offerings were the real obligations. And now there was a doubt, there was a mess up. The kohen forgot, the woman forgot. It's like when the sheep dies. What happens? The new sounds coming from the 7 instruments are not detached. No, they are a continuum of the original voice, of the original sound of the sheep. These 7 new birds, they're much more than the original birds. You had 4 birds, they now turned into 7 birds. They may have turned into 8 birds. That's like the sheep. The one sound turned into 7 sounds, turned into 8 sounds, but they're all one sound. They're a continuum of that sound. Yes, it's the rainbow. The sound is expressing itself in different shapes, in different instruments, they touch different aspects of the human perception and the human taste for music. Some of us love the harp, some of us love the lyre, some of us are infatuated by the drum, some of us like the bell, and some of us appreciate the trumpet. But its manifestations, its diverse manifestations of a singular koil, all these karbonas, which came as a result of doubts, are all a continuum of koiloi, of that original sound, that original voice of the sheep. They all have the geder chayva, they all assume the status of the original offering, which was an absolute obligation. In the footnotes here, there's a lot of very heavy footnotes explaining the various sugyas in Gemara and in Rambam about how we deal with karbonas that are sfeikas, karbonas that we bring because of doubts, because we don't know what's happening. I wish we would have real time for this, but this would be another hour or 2 getting into the details of the footnotes. I'm just pointing this out for those who are listening to this shit. I want to go deeper because there's a lot to discuss here from a halachic point of view. Is it really that the sages almost felt that this was just a situation that was so stuck and they found a heter and they found a pasuk to say that you're allowed to bring karbonis even when there is a doubt and it's not called chulin ba'azara? Or there is actually a unique situation here which Rabbi Yeshua is saying, where even though you didn't eat these karbanas chatoyas because they were brought al asafik, but they have a unique status like the original karbanas, like the first sound of the sheep, because the 7 sounds, the 7 birds, are really a continuum of the first sound, even though death happened in between, which is represented by all the doubts of the kohen and all the doubts of the woman. Hey, asibas ha-carbon is nor mitzad ha-sofik, heint wie azoi vet der carbon achiv gleich wie carbon chayva, gefind men kama dugmoyes as am suvev, ba kommt mehr teukef wie sein sibbe. Mehem. Aleph, bei Dinei Sukkah, Nesodim was Rachban Arba und Hafchan al Sidein Shen Ben Marba, is der Din, as euch demolt in das Possel. The Kivan the Yeshem Psul Alei Nasu Keshpudin Shal Matches, ha Psulin Lesachech Bechol Inyan Shahifchan, Zetman, As chodsch des Sibbe vetam was yesh shem psul alein. Is mit zat gzeides tikre. But das is daf geifen zat was rochav arba, was rochban arba. Vert es aber kishpuden shal matches a psul atzmi, mele sein ze posel euchal atzad, wenn es is nit talking gzeides tikre. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is now going to branch this off into different parts of halacha. We have here a phenomenon that this carbon was triggered by doubt, and yet it's assuming the status of an absolute obligation like the original four birds. In halacha, we have a phenomenon where the result becomes far more potent and forceful than the cause. The antecedent, the source, becomes a source for something that will gain much more power, potency, and prominence. In halachic terminology, or philosophical terminology, the mesuvav becomes stronger than the siba. Which is what's happening here, because initially the woman had to bring 4 birds. Those were absolute Torah obligations, no question. That absolute obligation now ultimately resulted in a mess because of doubts and questions and problems and uncertainties, and we don't know if I'm obligated, I'm not obligated, how much I'm obligated, which one I'm obligated on. Oila, chatos, the first set, the second set. Because of these doubts now give birth to 7 new birds that I have to bring, the mother has to bring, the kohen has to bring, the mother has to bring through the kohen. And these have the status like the first sound of the sheep, like the first voice, like the first 4 birds. So there's a certainty that triggers and results in a doubt that triggers a new certainty. So he brings here 2 examples from many. You could bring many, but he brings 2. Very interesting examples. Actually, these 2 examples, the Rebbe would... I heard it from the Rebbe myself a few times in different conversations, different sichas. The first is psukkah. Very briefly. The Chachamim said if you have a board, a neser is like a board, a plank of wood, and the width of it is 4 tfachim, you're not allowed to use it as schach, even though it's good schach. It's wood, it grows from the ground, it wasn't fashioned into a utensil, so it's good, you can use it for schach. But they had a problem. It's called Gzeirus Tikra. Gzeirus Tikra means if it's 4 tfachim, which means it's 4 hand breadths, when you look up, it looks like a roof because it's so wide. So then you may come to think, I could just sit under the roof of my house. It's called Gzeirus Tikra. So they said, don't use that board. But here's the deal. What happens if that board is 4 tfachim, 4 hand breadths wide, but the thick of it, the height of it, is only 1 tefach. It's very thin in its thickness. So you know what you could do? Just turn it over. Turn it over on its side. And now the breadth of it is it's very small. It's maybe a half a tefach or a tefach or 2 tefachim. Right? So the height will be 4 tefachim. That I don't care about. Could you do that or not? So the halacha is that you're not allowed to do it. Why not? Why not? This is a discussion in Sukkah, Daf Yedalad, in Rambam Hilchos Sukkah, in Shulchan Aruch Taf Reish Chavtes. You see it in the footnotes, footnote 33, footnote 34. He brings all the sources in the footnote. Why not? The answer is, very interestingly, even though the reason why these boards are not used in Sukkah is because we're afraid that somebody's going to compare it to a roof. But once the Chachamim said that these boards are puzzle, they're disqualified, they become essentially puzzle. And therefore, even if you turn them around in a different direction and the original factor and reason is gone, but because this board became essentially disqualified for schach, it's disqualified under all circumstances. It's called keshpudin shal matches. It becomes like a metal pole, and a metal pole cannot be used for schach. Metals can't be used for schach. You have to use something that grows from the ground and also is not fashioned into a utensil which is susceptible to tumah. So a metal stick, a metal pole, a metal stave cannot be used as schach. No difference which direction. Even though the Chachamim prohibited this board. Why? Because it's wide 4 tfachim and it looks like a roof. And in this case, it doesn't look like a roof. But when they said it's puzzle, what happens? They said it is puzzle. So the psul now becomes, so to speak, part of the very reality of the board. This board is disqualified for schach. It's psul atzmi. It's like innately not good. It's not just if it's in this direction or that direction. So therefore, even if there's no gzeres tikra, even though right now you turn it on its side, so the width is only 1 tefach, the thick is now 4 tefachim, it's still not good. It's possible. What's the concept here? This is a very similar concept. Because why did they make it possible? What made it possible? A specific gzeres tikra, right? Now in this situation, there's no gzeres tikra. But the result of gzeres tikra becomes more powerful than gzeres tikra. In other words, if it will only remain possible because of gzeres tikra, the psul only had to be if you put it on top of your sukkah in a way that it's covered. It covers 4 tfachim of your sukkah. But you didn't do it that way. So even though the source, the siba, the reason, the progenitor, what triggered the psul, what created the psul was gzeres tikra, which is a specific concern. The result of it becomes more powerful than gzeres tikra. How do I know? Because even in a situation where there's no gzeres tikra, it's still possible. It's a psul atzmi, so the result is more powerful than the siba. Because the result becomes more potent and it's possible even when there's no gzeres tikra. Another example, Beis. Divriach sam soifa yeduim benegei yom tov sheni shel chag hashvuos. Es chamor von andere yom tov sheni shel golius, weil is bei ba nit mit zat sofik wie andere yom tovim, na hatten sich a koyach shel vadai. Hey, aber chag hashvuos es came on the given asaf bei Pesach v'sukkos v'lan kvises yom chamishim loimen. Und das was man macht shvuos 2 Tage is bloß shalei lachlik b'mayadais. Kommt es, as si bosse the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Chag HaShavuos is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Pesach v'Sukkos. Lachlik b'mayadus, not a suffix. Es wird aber in Yom Tov Sheni von Shavuos a Teuke v'Kerch Shel Vadai mehr wie Pesach v'Sukkos. Gewaltige Wort. Chsam Sofer is a Wort. Chsam Sofer shal Setshuvas Erechayim Simen Kuf Mem Hei. Chsam Sofer wrote this tshuva on Toiv Tammuz Tov Kuf Tzaddik Aleph, the 17th of Tammuz, 1831. He passed away 1839. Chsam Sofer, Reb Moshe Schreiber, was the Rav of Pressburg. Then it was in the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Today it's called Bratislava. Reb Moshe Sofer, Chsam Sofer. And his Chalsei Tshuvos are classics in halacha. The Rebbe had an affinity to Chalsei Tshuvos Chsam Sofer. He mentioned it pretty often. All of Chalsei Chsam Sofer. I'm just saying that parenthetically. What's the story? Chsam Sofer got a question. There was somebody who was very ill. It was the second day of Shavuos. And he had a wife. They never had children. And he was afraid that if he dies on the second day of Shavuos, she's going to need Yibum. She's going to have to get married. Many of you are learning Mesechta Kinin. She'd have to get married to his brother. The Yavam was far away. So it may not be easy to get chalitza. She may remain an aguna. She won't be able to marry another man. So he wanted to give a get on the second day of Shavuos, but you have to sign a get. You're not allowed to write on Yom Tov. So there was a particular rabbi who tried to find a leniency to do it because it's the second day of Yom Tov and in order to help this woman, in case the husband dies. There was another rabbi who opposed it vehemently, and he felt maybe that he was wrong. And he wrote a letter to the Chsam Sofer. The Chsam Sofer writes a long letter. It's a very, very interesting letter. It's a classic letter, like many letters of the Chsam Sofer. But at the end, he adds one point about Shavuos, literally in the last few lines, but somehow the Rebbe zoomed into that. And he says there's something about Shavuos that's unique. Why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov? And the answer is, because in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash, they used to send out messengers to tell everybody when Rosh Chodesh is, because Rosh Chodesh could be either on day 30, right? You have 29 days, and then day 30 becomes the new month. Or Rosh Chodesh could be day 1. So you have 29, 30, and then day 1 is Rosh Chodesh, and then Pesach would be a day later. So they used to send out messengers to tell the crowd, the Jews all over the diaspora, when Pesach is, when Sukkot is. Now, some places lived far away from Eretz Yisrael, so they didn't get the message. So they had to do Pesach 2 days, because they weren't sure that Pesach started a day earlier. If Rosh Chodesh was a day earlier, that Pesach started a day later. The same is true with Sukkot. By Shavuos, there was never a problem. Why? Because Shavuos is not based on the day of a month. Shavuos is based on 50 days since the counting of Daimer. You count 49 days, and the 50th day you celebrate Shavuos. So Shavuos essentially could be Hey Sivan, Vav Sivan, Zayin Sivan. By the time Rosh Chodesh Sivan came around, by the time Iyar came around, every Jew knew when Pesach was. So they just count 49 days from the second day of Pesach, and the 50th day is Shavuos. So you don't have to know when Rosh Chodesh Sivan was to know when Shavuos is. So essentially, nobody should celebrate 2 days of Shavuos. Everybody, even in the diaspora, should celebrate 1 day of Shavuos. So why do we have 2 days of Shavuos? The answer is, Shalai Lachlek B'Mayadis. The Rambam says in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, chapter 3, the Chazal didn't want to distinguish between the 3 holidays. Pesach in America would be 2 days, Sukkot would be 2 days, in the beginning and at the end, and Shavuos would be 1 day. They said, you know what, let's keep it uniform. So Shavuos will also be 2 days. So the Chassam Sofer says this means that in many ways, Shavuos is more stringent. The second day of Shavuos is more stringent than the second day of Pesach, and the second day of Sukkot, and Simchas Torah, the last day of Sukkot, and the last day of Pesach, Achim Shel Pesach. Why? By Pesach and Sukkot, there's a doubt. Maybe it's Yom Tov, maybe it's not. And because that doubt, the Jews kept 2 days. And today also, Mineg Aviseinu B'Yadeinu, we keep that tradition. Even though today we have a calendar, we don't need these chishbon. We don't have the problem. But Shavuos, even in ancient times, why was Shavuos created? Not because there was a doubt. The second day wasn't a doubt. We know for sure it's not Shavuos. The reason is not to distinguish between other holidays. In other words, it's not because of a doubt. It's because of a vaday. The Chachamim say there's no doubt here. We know it's not Shavuos. It's a vaday. In order not to distinguish between Shavuos and other holidays, we are establishing that the second day of Shavuos should be kept as a Yom Tov. Chassam Sofer says it has a koyach of vaday, not of suffix, because there was never a suffix by Shavuos. It's the Chachamim said initially, it's not because you don't know you're in limbos, 50 yeah, 50 not, so we don't take chances. No, Shavuos, we don't have to not take chances. It's not Shavuos. So why is it Shavuos? Because the Chachamim said we're making a Yom Tov, like Chanukah, like Purim, a Yom Tov. We're making a Yom Tov. Shalai Lachlik B'Mayadas. So we have here an interesting phenomenon. The reason we celebrate the second day of Shavuos is because of Pesach and Sukkot. And why do we celebrate the second day of Pesach and Sukkot? Because of a doubt. And that's what triggers, that's what creates, that's what generates the second day of Shavuos. But once the student, Shavuos is the offspring, Shavuos is the result, but the result becomes more powerful than the source. Because Shavuos has something that Pesach and Sukkot doesn't have. It has the toikif, it has the potency of vaday, of certainty. Here we have examples how that which is born from the cause, from the source, gains power and forcefulness that doesn't exist in the source. And that's the concept that we have here in this carbon. These 7 birds were all born out of doubt, out of suffix, out of a mess, out of a situation that cripples us. It's because we don't know, we're confused. And yet the confusion, like the death of the sheep, doesn't just interrupt the process. It creates a new identity that goes back to the original obligation. And that original obligation was an absolute certainty, so that the result is more powerful than the source. The Chevra understand, your typhus. Oh, wow. Okay. I see the mic is about to die, so I'm just changing the battery. So give me one moment. I'm just changing the battery. I'll be back in a moment. I'll give an example from another realm, the realm of psychology. And the reason it's like that in psychology and in the world of the soul, in the world of the mind, it's because it's like that in our own world. It's like that in Torah. Torah is the blueprint for the world. I've heard this from so many people, and especially from mental health professionals. There are often things that happen in people's lives that are very disturbing and sometimes extremely, extremely devastating. And yet, that's the cause. The result of what happens sometimes becomes much more destructive than the cause of what triggered the entire trauma. So for example, people sometimes experience a trauma. They experience an event that is very disturbing, that compromises their brain's functioning powers, that compromises their self-conceptualization, the way they see themselves. And yet that in itself may not be the most devastating factor. What becomes the really devastating factor is the way the original trauma is processed by the person. The result becomes much more toxic than the cause. Last Shabbos, I was at a recovery Shabbos in Miami. There were around 800 people in recovery, 900 people in recovery. Friday night, I sat up a whole night with a group of people in recovery, amazing people. And there was a young man who shared with me how he was violated for 5 years. 5 years he was violated, he was abused. And he shared with me the details. It's not for now, obviously. And he looks at me and with tears in his eyes, he says, and you know what the worst thing was? When I finally got the courage to tell my father what happened, he told me, it's not true, I don't believe a word you say. So that was far worse than the abuse. You could cry when you hear it. Because he told me that was the abuse happening all over again, but much worse, because it was happening by the person who was supposed to protect me. So you see what happens? We go through stuff. That's the siba. They all cause something, and it's powerful, and it's sometimes, you have it in the positive, you have it in the negative. But the mesuvav, what happens as a result of that, that's where the biggest power sometimes lay. The way I processed it, not what happened, but what I'm telling myself till today. Trauma is not what happened. Trauma is what's happening right now in my body. It's stuck in my body. How did I process it then? How do I process it today? How did the people around me process it? What was the message I got from the people when I shared with them this story? How it was dealt with by my closest circle. That's the mesuvav. And sometimes, tragically, the mesuvav gains this power, this ferocious power, l'toiva l'mutiv, in the positive and the negative, that the original story doesn't have. The reason it's like that in psychology is because it's like that in the soul. It's because it's like that in Torah, and that's what we're learning here. There's the original voice, there's the original sound, and then there's the 7 sounds. And those 7 sounds all come from that original sound. And in the middle there was a death, it should have weakened it. No, sometimes the mesuvav is much stronger than the siba. You have to be aware of these things. We have to be aware of the power of the result. You know, the shadchan, if you want a cute way of saying it, the shadchan creates the shidduch, but hopefully the relationship becomes much deeper than what the shadchan created. True, without the matchmaker, the chassan and the kala would have never met. But the result of it gains a whole new level of relationship and depth that the shadchan couldn't have. Because he brings out what's inside of you. A teacher may produce a student and may raise the student and mentor the student and guide and educate the student. But sometimes the student grows far beyond the imagination of the teacher. Yes, it was all created by the cause, by the source. But sometimes the result, it reaches a whole different level. And the Rebbe gives you the 2 examples of Sukkah and the example of Shavuos the Chassam Sofer, which brings us back to the example of the karbanos that the mother has to bring. We now go to the next step. The next step is Seif Vav. Se'ivav, I'm going to say outside because I want to be able to finish the Sicha and the hour is late. And there's a lot here. So even though Se'ivav we could sit on for an hour or 2 hours, it's a lebedik asif. But I'm going to say it outside. You could learn it inside. I hope you learn it inside. I'm going to say it outside. Based on all this, we'll now understand that there's also the other side of it. Rabbi Yeshua is not just explaining the karbonos of the mother. He's also explaining the uniqueness of the sheep that died. As we said, the Mishnah is not here to explain interesting natural phenomena about how you make instruments, even though it's amazing, and what happens when the ram dies. He's also explaining a halachic idea. And one of them may be the following scenario, fascinating scenario. And this is what the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains. There's a halacha. It's discussed at length in Mesechta Avodah Daf Mem Vav, Daf Mem Zayin. It's discussed in Rambam. In Hilchis Isurei Mizbeach, it's discussed. It's a Mishnah in Tmura Daf Chav Ches. Here's the issue. If somebody worships something as a deity, as a god, it becomes forbidden to benefit from. Asur b'hana. But what happens if it's something that a person doesn't affect? It's something that's natural, and you didn't change it around. It's not like a statue that you build. You sculpture a statue and you worship it. Let's say you decide to worship an animal. Yeah? There's a sheep, like the Hindus, the old ancient Egyptians, you have a sheep and you worship the sheep. You bow down to the sheep. You believe for whatever reason that your sheep is God. What's the halacha? The halacha is that the sheep does not become forbidden to eat or forbidden to have anah because it's a natural sheep. You didn't change actually the sheep. It's not like you slaughtered the sheep for Avodah Zarah. You did not. The sheep is alive. You just worship it. So you actually don't manipulate the sheep because you can't. It's a natural phenomenon that God created and you can't change it unless you physically change it around. And therefore, if a Jew takes this sheep and slaughters it, for example, you're allowed to eat it. It's mutar b'hana. You're not allowed to bring this sheep as a carbon. We learn out from Sukkim that when it comes to Gavai, when it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, a sheep that was worshipped, even though it's alive, it's pasal l'mizbeach. You're not allowed to use it for the altar. Now here's an interesting question that the Gemara raises in Avodah Zarah Daf Mem Vav. The question is as follows: Yesh shinui l'nevad or ain't shinui l'nevad? If somebody worships the sheep, but then the sheep goes through a major transformation, does it revoke the original status of the fact that it was used for idolatry and you're not allowed to use it in the Beis HaMikdash? Or ain't shinui l'nevad? The transformation doesn't transform the original status that this was used for Avodah Zarah. An example, Rami Bar Chama says, let's say somebody worships stalks of wheat. They didn't touch it, they just worshipped it. I don't know why, but a person does that. Now you take this wheat, and you harvest the wheat, and you extract the kernels, and you grind the kernels into flour, and you want to use this flour as a carbon mincha. Are you allowed to or not? Interesting question. Another example, let's say somebody bows down to an animal. Can you use its wool to make tchelis for the garments of the Kohen Gadol? Can you use the horns of a bull to make trumpets in the Beis HaMikdash? Can you use the thighs of the animal to make flutes to use for the concerts in the Beis HaMikdash? Can you use the intestines of the animal to make and weave strings for the harp? Very interesting question. Yes, shinui l'nevad, or ain't shinui l'nevad? Wow. What's the question? Why is this a question? The Gemara actually answers teku. Some of these questions is teku. They're not sure about it. We'll soon see what the halach is. What's the question? The question is as follows. Is it the original sheep or it's not the original sheep? It's a fascinating question. And that's exactly what Rabbi Yeshua is addressing. The Lubavitcher Rebbe Yeshua is not addressing just a sheep and music and a cute little statement that somebody made about a living sheep and a dead sheep. No. He's addressing a very serious question that's essential to halacha. What's the problem? The problem is the ram is dead. You worship the sheep, you worshiped a bull, you worshiped an ox, okay? Now it's dead. It's a new reality. You took the horns of the ox or the horns of the ram and you turned it into a trumpet for the Beis HaMikdash. Is this considered a trumpet that was worshipped? It comes from the ox that was worshipped. It comes from the ram that was worshipped. Are you allowed to use it or not? We learn out from the Torah you can't use this animal as a carbon. I get it. But what happens if it goes through a transformation? You take the wool and you turn it into tchelis. You take a part of the animal, you turn it into a musical instrument. Can you use it in the Beis HaMikdash? First of all, the animal is dead. Second of all, you completely transformed the organ. From an intestine, you made a drum, you made a lyre, you made a harp, you made from the horns a trumpet. It's not anymore part of a holistic animal. It's completely self-contained, and it's not even an organ, it's a musical instrument. Most people wouldn't even know if they didn't know how it was made, that it was made from an organ. Is it mutter or is it aser? And the halacha is that it is forbidden. It's forbidden. That's the halacha. And that's what Rabbi Yeshua is saying. Rabbi Yeshua is actually explaining something in halacha. Even though the trumpets made from the horns, and even though the strings of the lyre and the harp made from the intestines comes from a dead ram, and it's now separated from the original ram, and it's not just separated, it went through a metamorphosis and a transformation, and the 7 sounds are not the original sound of a sheep. It's not even the original sound of a thigh bone or of hide. It's a whole new sound. It's a trumpet. It's a flute. It's a drum. It's a lyre. It's a harp. It's not anymore the sound of the organs of the sheep or of the mouth of the sheep. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, koiloi shiva. Koiloi shiva. Even as it's 7 different sounds. Halachically, the Torah sees it as koiloi. I can still hear the sheep. And therefore, because you worship this sheep for Avodah Zarah, this transformation is ineffective and you can't use it for the Beis HaMikdash. As I said, you can use the sheep for mundane purposes. And that's the halacha in Rambam, Isurei Mizbeach, Perek Daled, in Meiri, Mesechta Avodah Zarah, even though the Gemara has Teiku. The Kesef Mishnah discusses this. So Rabbi Yeshua here intimated the halacha, even though in Gemara it's Teiku. Fascinating. So you'll say, so why didn't the Gemara give an answer? It's a good question. So the Gemara should have had an answer. Why does the Gemara say Teiku? It could be the Gemara understood that Tanoim are arguing about it, but here in Mesechta Kinin, this is the view of Rabbi Yeshua. But it goes much deeper, because you could explain this in 2 ways. You could say that the reason the trumpets are disqualified, the reason that the drum or the flute or the lyre or harp is disqualified is because it ultimately comes from a ram that was worshipped. And therefore, that prohibition remains. But you can't say that they are defined as Avodah Zarah. They come from something that was worshipped, and therefore we say, don't use it. Or maybe no, maybe it still has the same status like the original sheep, which was disqualified for the Mizbeach. It's called Avodah Zarah. And that's what we see from the Rambam. The Rambam's language in Hilchos Isurei Mizbeach is, he quotes it in 50, footnote 50, that if somebody bows down to an animal, just as the animal is disqualified for the altar, the wool is disqualified for the Bigdei Kohuna, the horns are disqualified for trumpets, Hakol Posel. When the Rambam uses the word Keshem Kach, Keshem Shenifsel Al Mizbeach, Kach Tzemer Shel Posel LeBigdei Kohuna, V'Karneh Psulun LeChatzotzos Hakol Posel. The Keshem Kach, the Rambam is trying to say something. He could have just said, you're not allowed to use the wool, you're not allowed to use the horns. The Rambam is trying to say it's the same geder like the original animal. Just like the original animal is disqualified for the Mizbech because it was worshipped as an idolatry, so you can't use it for a carbon. It's for Hashem. So the same is true when you want to use the wool for Bigdei Kohuna, and you want to use the horns for trumpets, and you want to use the hide for a drum, and you want to use the intestines for the thighs for flutes, and the intestines for a lyre and a harp. It has the same geder. It's the geder of Avodah Zarah. And the difference would be that the Isur is an Isur D'Oraisa. It's not just an Isur D'Rabbanan. According to the first version, it's a new reality. Just the rabbis say, since it comes from this sheep, don't use it. According to the second way of learning it, it's prohibited min HaTorah. It's a biblical prohibition because this was worshipped, even though now it's a trumpet. This is Rabbi Yeshua's Chiddush. Zeu she'amru k'shehu chai. The halacha in the Mishnah by Kinim explains to me what they said. Who's they? They is not just some quotable quoter in the world. They represents also the hashkafa of the Chachamim. that they said that the sheep, when it's alive, it has one voice, one sound. And when it dies, it's the same sound, manifested in 7 different sounds. It's the same sound. It's the same keves. And therefore, if it was used for Avodah Zarah, the Chalilin and the Beis HaMikdash have a gedra for Avodah Zarah. The Torah says you're not allowed to use them. And that's the Chiddush of the Rambam in Hilchos Yisurim Mizbeach Perek Daled. Perek Daled, Halacha Zayin. And this needs an explanation, and that's the explanation. Just like by Kinin, even though what triggered the obligation was a suffix, the woman and the kohen don't know what happened. Nonetheless, the new obligations, the new 7 birds, have the same status as the original 4 birds. It's the same voice, like the original voice, like the original sound of the sheep. The same is true when the sheep is used for Avodah Zarah, even though the horns and the thighs and the intestines went through a major metamorphosis and they became a new entity. And you can't say that they should be disqualified for the altar. Like originally they were part of a sheep that was worshipped. They're not part of this sheep anymore. First of all, the sheep is dead. Second of all, they were detached from the sheep. Third of all, they went through a transformation. You don't even recognize the connection. We say, Kishahu meis koiloi shiva. It's the same koil, it's the same keves expressed in 7 different instruments. Or like we said before, by sukkah, those boards that are wide 4 tfachim have a psul atzmi. They essentially become disqualified for the sukkah, not just because gzeiras tikra. It becomes an innate quality. Each one of these organs becomes essentially avodah zarah. It has a psul atzmi. And therefore, even now when it was detached, it continues it maintains and retains that very same status. Kishpudin shel avodah zarah. It's like the sukkah, we say shpudin shel matchas, it became metal. They became like shpudin shel avodah zarah. The name avodah zarah, nevad, and the Isra in the Beis HaMikdash becomes the very status of the horns and the thighs and the flutes and the thighs and the intestines. Why? That's the chiddush of koilei shiva. You could say the source is the sheep. I'm just a weak copy of it and now I'm detached. No, you're a direct continuum of it. That's what we see by Kinin. And here too, the Isra of Avodah Zarah, it becomes part of their very identity. And therefore you can't use it in the Beis HaMikdash, even min HaTorah. Now we'll understand why the Mishnah has to talk about the Amei Ha'aretz and the Ziknei Torah. This is Siv Zayin. We have here a problem. What's the problem? The story of the sheep, alive or dead, is not very similar to the story of the mother giving birth and bringing karbanos. Why? By the sheep, it's a one-time event. The sheep was alive and it died. Death is a momentary experience. In the story of the birds, it was a gradual process. And there's many different scenarios. The first case is the kohen didn't know what the woman wanted, and he offered 2 birds on top, 2 birds on the bottom, so she has to bring 1 more bird. Then there's another story which makes her bring 2 more birds. Another story which makes her bring 3, 4, 5, 6, until we reach 7 or 8. In other words, there's many, many different scenarios. It's different. By the sheep, the transformation is in a moment. Boom! Sheep is dead. From 1, you got 7. By the woman, it doesn't happen that way. It's not like she forgot, the kohen forgot, 7 birds. No. First is 1, then is 2, then is 3, then is 4, then is 5, then is 6, and is 7. So the example doesn't mamish match up. It's a good example, generally speaking, because the sheep went through a transformation from life to death, and yet the sounds increased 7-fold, just like here. There was a problem and a doubt and a mess, and the offerings increase all the way to number 7. But you can't compare it because here there's so many levels. You get from 1 to 7, takes a long time. There's different scenarios in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, let me bring another example. Reb Shimon ben Akashi says, take a look at elderly people who are Amei Haaretz, who are completely ignorant. They did not spend their life with Torah. The older they get, the more confused they get. Ziknei Torah kol zman. The older they get, the more settled they become. This is not something that happens in one moment. You don't get old in a single instant. It's not like death. Sheep is alive, the sheep is dead. This is a process. Aging is a process. It doesn't happen in a moment. Kol zman. It's a process, and it's gradual. A person gets older, a person gets weaker. So that's a much more accurate example in this sense, that as we get older, our bodies change, our brains change, and therefore our level of perceptiveness, our mental capacity, our intellectual capacity, our cerebral capacities, they all go through a transformation. And that's why the Mishnah has to first speak about Ziknei Amei Haaretz before Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim. Because Reb Shimon ben Akashi is telling us something. He's telling us when people get old, their bodies change. Their brains change. That's why the Amei Haaretz, the older they get, the weaker they get, including in their mental capacity. The Talmid Chacham also goes through this change. He also gets older. She also gets older. And naturally, the brain should get weaker and weaker, as we see by Ziknei Amei Haaretz. They're just responding to the natural process of aging. And yet, we see a unique phenomenon, that by a Talmid Chacham, the older they get, the wiser they get, the deeper they get, the more settled they become. What happens? You would think they're Talmidei Chachamim. So maybe spare them the terrible aging process. Let their intellectual capacity remain intact. Unlike the Ziknei Amei Haaretz, right? Who become confused. But here we say something much deeper than that. It's not just the aging process doesn't affect their ability to learn. On the contrary, the aging process increases their ability to learn even more when they were young. Here we have a beautiful manifestation and illustration to the very concept of kinim, of these karbanos the woman was bringing. As long as they get older, it's not a one-time event. It's just like by the woman. You didn't get from 1 to 7 like this. It's a process. Every day I get a little older. I get a little weaker. This stops functioning a little bit. This stops functioning a little bit. And the mind becomes weaker. And that's what the Amei Haaretz is experiencing. Kol zman shemaskinim. The two words here are key words. Kol zman, as long as they get older. It's a concept, it's a process that is ongoing gradually. And the Talmid Chacham also experiences this. And with each physical decline, there's a certain spiritual ascent. With each physical decline, the brain becomes sharper, more mature, more deep, more authentic. And this is also relevant halachically. It's not just an interesting statement, because the Sanhedrin needs to have Balei Zikna, people of great wisdom. So when you see the greater wisdom, you're more equipped to be in the Sanhedrin, as he discusses in the footnotes. It's just like by the Kinim. With every dissent, with every doubt, with every mess that should create a big, more havoc, there's more karbanos, more obligations. You see, it's like Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim. The older you get, with each descent, every day, he should get weaker and weaker. No, his mind gets stronger and stronger. But in order to understand this, you first have to talk about Ziknei Amei Haaretz, because you have to speak about the decline. What's supposed to happen here is there is more decline and more decline, just like with the story of the woman. There is more doubts and more doubts and more doubts. And what do we see by the Amei Haaretz? There is more decline and more decline and more decline. And yet what happens by the Talmid Chacham? The exact opposite. The contrast with the Amei Haaretz allows us to understand what is happening here. It allows us to understand the process of how things are getting worse and worse. And we would expect the Talmid Chacham should at least remain intact, which would be amazing. We say, no, he becomes more powerful in his learning and more strong in his learning. Ziknei Torah kol zman shemaskinim daitum misyashevas alei. And you see it. You see it with real Talmidei Chachamim. The older they get, there's a unique light that comes from their face, from their mind, from their words. The older they get, you see. The Rebbe used to say, "Mevet elte mit hatag, wird men mevet elte mit hatag, wird men kliger mit hatag, wird men flimmer mit hatag." You become older one day, you become smarter and wiser, and you become more committed. You become more conscious of the divine. A Talmid Chacham whose life is dedicated to Torah, to truth, to godliness, to holiness, even in the aging process, they may physically become weaker and you can see it, but there's something emotionally and spiritually and intellectually that just becomes stronger and more powerful. I think we can all experience this when you see a real Talmid Chacham. It's not just their physical aging doesn't affect their mental capacity. That's also true. And a lot of research today about how when you dedicate your life to learning and you're part of a community of learning and you challenge yourself to learn and teach, it also helps simply, Be'ezer Hashem, it helps also for longevity. It's a very interesting research that I saw in recent years that was done around this. But that's all part of this. But that's exactly the point. So that's what he has to bring out. That kol zman shemaskinim. There is descent. It's not just ziknei talmidei chacham. Talk about ziknei am haaretz. Yes, you have to bring out natural phenomenon. You're supposed to be losing your mind. More doubts. You forget things. The woman forgets. The kohen forgets. The old man forgets. The old woman forgets. Everybody's forgetting things. And yet what happens from all of her forgetfulness? She brings 7 new karbonis, and the 7 new karbonis are as powerful as the original karbonis. Like the Ziknei Talmidei Chacham, he's getting older, he's getting more forgetful. No, Daitam is Yashavas Alein. There's more Torah, there's more Kedusha, there's more karbonis, there's more closeness, there's more Yiras Shamayim. Of course, the first example brings out certain ideas that the second example doesn't bring out. That's where Rabbi Yeshua first brings out the sheep situation, because that brings out, of course, the whole idea of the 7 and the 8, which you don't have with Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim. It also brings out the idea that it's the same koil, but the Ziknei Amei Haaretz brings out this other facet, and that's where Rabbi Shimon ben Akashia adds this aspect. We now come to the last piece of the Sicha. This is Sif Ches. And this concludes the whole conversation. The Sicha now goes from the Nigla to the Nister, from the halachic to the hashkafic, from the practical components of Jewish law to the exploration of the spiritual, emotional, psychological, and historical deeper dimensions that are being conveyed here in the Mishnah. And this is Sif Ches. I'm going to read this inside. Ches. Der Biur bepnimi sanyanam and the Biur hashaychus Rabbi Yeshua dafke vastam kinim Rabbi Yeshua. Why Rabbi Yeshua? And what's the explanation on a deeper level? And the Gemara says in Zvachim Samach Zayin that the Mishnahs in Kinim, unless a name is specified, it comes from Rabbi Yeshua. So this is Rabbi Yeshua's baby, so to speak. Seder Kachem weiß bechlal if Eden was an Agoy Kaddish. Euch die Chulin Zeire is a chelik von Kachem. Euch Mesechta Kinin is a chelik von Seder Kachem. Wow. Seder Kachem is the section of Shas, of Mishnah, that deals with karbonis, holiness. There's a tractate called Chulin, which means the mundane, which deals with regular animals that we eat on a daily basis. They're not offered in the Beis HaMikdash. Comes the Rebbe and says, where's Mesechta Kinin? It's in Seder Kachem. That's a Jew. Every Jew is part of Goy Kaddish. We're a holy people. The Chulin of a Jew is also Kachem. Chulin is also a din in Kachem. Mesechta Chulin of your life is part of Kachem. There's no Chulin that's divorced from Kachem. By a Jew, everything is Kedusha. Seder Kachem captures the mission statement of Am Yisrael, Goy Kaddish. We are a holy, sacred people. We are sensitive to holiness. We are holy. Our job is to reveal the holiness, to cultivate a life of holiness, and to fill the world with holiness, beginning with our hearts, our brains, our homes, our families, our communities. And even the Chulin, every one of our lives has Chulin. It has a lot of mundaneness, mundane parts. It's all part of Kachem. It's all part of Kedusha. There's no separateness. B'siyum Seder Kachem. At the end of Kachem, is Memavai dem Inyan HaYoyledes was weiss of the Geula von Yidden, ki yadu as der Golus is nimshal leibur, the Geula leide, wie es steht in Nevuas HaGeula, Chola gam yolda tzion es bonau. As we come to the conclusion of Kachem, it's the conclusion of the Jewish journey of filling the world with holiness. We come to the last theme of Kachem, a woman who gives birth to a baby or babies, which represents redemptiveness. Exile is compared to pregnancy. Redemption is compared to birth, as the Nevuah compares Geula to the mother giving birth. By Yetzias Mitzrayim as well, Yecheskel chapter 16, we say it in the Haggadah, the Exodus of Egypt was compared to birth, and the future Gula is compared to birth. Is Rabbi Yeshua Messiah, v'choisem u'mevayer, v'yazoi halt men ois bizman agolus, und men kommt zum Inyan ha'yeledes Geula. Zeu shomru ksho chai kole yechud ksho meis kole shiva. Steht in Medrash. Adrianus Omar le Rabbi Yeshua. G'doylo hakeves hoimedes ben shivim ze'evim Omar le gadol hu aroya shematzila v'shoimra v'shoivrim lefana. Was auf dem ist der Scheile. Bishleim wenn in sein Namatze von keves chai. Was bechlal das wenn es ist chai. In Eden de Madrege von da was Avram Yitzchak ve Yaakov is moving was aroya shoimra. The Eden was eine Madrege keves chai. Die Madreges von der Ovis ist nicht mehr begillen, es werden neue, 7 besondere Keules, was eine nittende Tage von Keule Jechet von der Ovis. Mis Chalukim ze in verschiedene Sugim, wie es bei se der Reue Shoimra. Auf dem sagt Rabbi Yeshua, Keshohu Meis Keule Shiva. Wie sagt der Medrash geffen mit Mitzrayim Tasiyah, Mahagefen Ichayev in Eshanes Aleitzim Meisim, Kach Yisrael Heim Chayim V'Kayomim V'Nishonim Al HaMeisim Eloavis. Das heißt, das, was es wird, Keule Shiva, 7 besondere Sugen bei Jeden, das nicht kein besondere Metzies Legamri, das ist verbunden und kein nimmt sich von Keuloi. Der Keul von dem Keves Chai die Ovois, was sie sind in die Ovois von alle und von jeder Jeden. Punkt wie bei der Ovis ist gewähnt der Keulei Echad Lavinu Shabashamayim, also das euch in alle 7 besondere Keules, als wie sie stehen als 7 Chalukim Madreges in Avodas Hashem, ist bei sie da in seiner Metzies der Keulei Echad Lavinu Shabashamayim. In jederen von der Shiva Keules ist da der Akel Kel Yaakov, was peilt, als ein Yedei Esav Sheltes Haraya Shemra. Und das ist der Bishom Madrish Shom Meis Keule Shiva. Das, was alle Shiva Chilukim Madreges im Chaim V'Kayamim, kommt das durch Shom Meis, was Neshanan ala Meisim Elu Ha'avis. Let me explain. Rabbi Yeshua at the end of Kachim tells us, how do we endure through exile? And how do we reach birth? How do we go through the labor pains and bring out Geula? And that's what he finishes with. So the whole Kachim is the journey of Klal Yisrael to Kedusha, to fill our lives, to fill the world with Kedusha. Even our Chulin is also Kachim. Mesechta Chulin is Kachim. At the end comes the birth. That's Meseches Kinin. But in birth there can be confusion. That's Kinin. And Rabbi Yeshua, who lived through the Beis HaMikdash, lived through Galus, but sang, he was the Levi. He teaches us how to endure. What's the secret of Jewish history? How do we endure Galus, and how do we come to the birth? It's interesting, the Gemara says, as I said, Rabbi Yeshua was the great fierce debater against the Gentiles. He's the one who kept up the Jewish pride, the Jewish dignity. He didn't let the Jews surrender to mediocrity, surrender to depression, surrender to fear, surrender to spinelessness. He was ready to debate everybody and show Torah is emes and God is true and mitzvahs are true and Yiddishkeit is true and Matan Torah is true. If you ever learned the Sugi in B'chaydes, is debates with the sages of Athens. They're trying to delegitimize Judaism, delegitimize Torah. B'chaydes Davches, you learn the Marshov and the Maharal's explanation. The Vilna Gaon wrote a sefer on those debates. Reb Nachman of Brest of Kedushas Levi, Celebedik and Freilich, but other Svarim, they bring out the depth of those debates between Rabbi Yeshua. This is Rabbi Yeshua. And he's the one who finally tells us how to get to the end of Kachim. Stam Kinim, Rabbi Yeshua. And for this, the Lubavitcher Rebbe brings a medrash, and you see how everything is connected. This is a medrash Rabbah in Megillas Esther, and Tanchuma told us. Adrian was one of the most brutal emperors of Rome, maybe the most brutal, one of the most brutal emperors of Rome. He's the one who crushed the Bar Kochva revolt. Adrianus. Some people say it wasn't Adrian, Adrianus is somebody else, but his Hebrew name is Adrianus. He was one of the Roman emperors. He once tells Rabbi Yeshua, the Jewish people are sheep, and they're surrounded by 70 wolves. 70 wolves. And he says, wow, this sheep is pretty impressive. It's surviving in the midst of 70 wolves that are trying to devour it. That's what Adrianus tells Rabbi Yeshua. You know what he says? He says, this sheep has a great shepherd, and the shepherd protects it and saves it and ultimately foils the schemes of all the wolves and breaks them down, doesn't allow them to devour the sheep. So Rabbi Yeshua is the one who's telling us which sheep he's talking about. He's talking about the sheep of Klal Yisrael. He's talking about this one innocent, beautiful, pure sheep. This sheep that the woman has to give as a carbon, the first carbon, as an oila. This sheep is protected by the shepherd. This is what Rabbi Yeshua says. So the Rebbe now puts it all together. He says, sometimes the sheep is alive. The Jewish people, Klal Yisrael, is alive. What does it mean we're alive? We're saturated with the consciousness of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the people who brought monotheism into the world, the founding fathers of Judaism. And then, of course, the shepherd protects it, just like the shepherd protected Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and promised them eternal protection, because the Jews are one with their fathers and mothers. We are a living sheep. And remember, our patriarchs were shepherds. They all dealt with sheep. Avram was a shepherd. Yitzchak was a shepherd. Yaakov was a shepherd. Avram Avinu brought Yitzchak as a substitute for the sheep, Hasela Oila. Yaakov worked for years and years and years with sheep. When we are connected to them, when we are alive, the shepherd protects us. But then comes a situation in history, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, and it looks like the sheep is dead. You don't see the vitality in the sheep. You don't see the consciousness of the avos being manifested in a revealed way in the sheep. In fact, when you listen to the sounds coming from the sheep, you hear different sounds. You don't hear that original sound, that original voice of the one sheep. You don't hear that koiloi echad, that consciousness of oneness, that singular koil of Hashem Shema Yisrael. The echad, the achdus, the koiloi echad, the consciousness of infinity, the consciousness of oneness. First of all, you see a nation that's splintered. A nation that has so many different sounds and so many different voices. Koiloi Shiva. We know there's 7 branches of the menorah. We're split up into 7 different branches. You might think, where's the shepherd? Where's the shepherd? Comes Rabbi Yeshua and says, don't make that mistake. You think the sheep died? You think that original sound is gone? You think you can't hear anymore the music of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Kashu meis koilei shiva. So the zel bekoil. You remember what we spoke about earlier in the shir halachically? It's the same koil. Don't be deceived. Don't forget that it's all from the sheep. All the different koilas, all the different sounds. It's one koil of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's not different koilas. Yes, it's manifested in different ways. You have flutes. You have people who sing on the flute, and you have drummers in Klal Yisrael, and you have violinists, and you have those who play on the harp, and those who play on the cello, and those who play on the lyre, and those who ring the bells. They walk around with the bells, and those who blow the trumpets, and those who blow the shofar. It's a koilai, it's one koil. It's expressed, it's filtered. It's channeled through different prisms. It's refracted through different colors of the rainbow. But it's coming from one sun, from one source of light. And on this there's a medrash. It says in Tehillim, Gefen mimitzrayim tasiya. You took out the vine from Egypt. The Jews are called the vine. So the medrash says when you look at a vine, you wrap the clusters of grapes around dead trees. You take trees that are dead or dead wood, and you need them to hold up the vines. So he says the Jews are sustained by the dead trees, the avos. When the Rebbe said over this medrash at the Fabrengen, he said, "So a gewaldige lashon and medrash." It's an astounding language in the medrash to call the avos eitzim mesim, dead trees. But that's what the medrash means. What the medrash means is that physically they passed away, and yet we are sustained by them. Gefen mimitzrayim tasiya. We lean on them. We continue them. Don't get deceived by Jewish diversity. Don't get deceived by the fact that there's so many different types of Jews. This is vintage Lubavitcher Rebbe. Don't get deceived by the fact that there's so many different types of people. Don't get deceived by all the voices inside of you, right? We all have a lot of voices. We all have a lot of conflicts. It's all one koil. You are a conduit of oneness. You are a conduit for oneness. You are an ambassador of infinity. You are a channel for the one light of God in this world, the light of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, because they are the fathers of every single Jew. Every koil of every Jew is ultimately a manifestation of the koil of the Avos. You have to be able to listen to its depth, and you'll hear the voice of Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov. They had one koil because they were connected to oneness, to their Father in heaven. And all the 7 voices in Klal Yisrael, with 7 different levels in Avodas Hashem, 7 branches of the menorah. If you listen carefully, you'll hear it's koiloi echad. In every Jew's koil, there's a koil Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. The hands are the hands of Esav. And Chazal say, when the voice of Yaakov is strong, the hands of Esav could not control and dominate Yaakov. And that's what the Gemara says in Mesechta Pesachim Daf Nun Vav. He brings it in 69, when Yaakov was on his deathbed and he was afraid that maybe one of his children has strayed off the path. And they told him, Shema Yisrael, listen Yisrael. His name was Yisrael. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Kashem Shein, Belibcho Ela Echad, Kachein Belibeinu Ela Echad. Just as in your heart is Echad, in our heart is Echad. What are they telling him? We know that we have so many different sounds, so many different voices. We don't have one tribe, we have 12 tribes, and there were so many differences. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun. Then you had Yosef. Yosef, they wanted to get rid of Yosef. He's not part of us. There's so many different sounds. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Kashem Shein, Belibcho Ela Echad, Kachein Belibeinu Ela Echad. It's one. We're not disconnected from our parents. We're not disconnected from our grandparents. We're not disconnected from our fathers, our mothers, our bubbas, our sayyidis, all the way back hundreds and thousands of years to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We know in epigenetics, our genes carry all of their experiences. It doesn't only carry the trauma of the past, it carries the faith and the resilience and the Mesiras Nefesh and the wisdom and the perceptiveness and the kindness and the love and the compassion and the commitment and the loyalty and the dedication and the depth and the truthfulness and the authenticity and the integrity and the purity of every Jew who ever lived. It's all transmitted in you and through you. Every gene of yours carries that koil. Yes, it may be expressed in different ways, but it's koiloi shiva. Kasho chai koiloi echad, kasho meis koiloi shiva. That's what Rabbi Yeshua is telling us at the end of Seder Kachim. How you have to view yourself, how you have to view the Jewish people, how you have to be able to look deep into your voice, listen to your voice, listen to the sound coming from you, and you'll see that what you're really searching for and what you're really trying to express is the koiloi echad of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now comes the last sif in the Shaila. The Rebbe says, wait. So the shepherd is protecting the sheep. Yes, you may think the sheep is dead, but trust me, the sheep is as alive as it gets. It's just a different type of life. It's continuing the life of the sheep in a different way, the life of Ram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore the shepherd protects it, as Rabbi Yeshua told to Adrianus Caesar, to Adrian the Roman emperor. But how long is the shepherd going to keep it among 70 wolves? How long does the sheep have to remain so vulnerable? How long is the gullahs going to be? So the Mishnah continues, Reb Shimon ben Akashya says, Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim, the older they get, the wiser they get, the better they get. That's the end of the Mishnah. It's not like God is just trying to torture Jews in Galus. Chas v'shalom. Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim. Wow. Such a powerful word. Every year that the Jews live through history, they become so much wiser, so much deeper, so much more powerful, so much more authentic. You know, we always talk about Yeridas Hadoros. You know, the generations go down, and in some ways they go down, but they also go up. Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim, the older they get, there's something about the Jewish people today. The Rebbe would always see this and talk about this. Something about the Jewish people today that is so beautiful, so pure, so refined. And if you don't see it, it's because you're Ziknei Amei Aretz. If you're Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim, you see it everywhere. And that's what happened by Yetzias Mitzrayim. Maybe the Jews wanted to go out earlier. They said, let's go out without all of the wealth. But Hashem said, no, I want you to go out with all the wealth. I want you to go out with all the sparks that are in Gullus. I want you to go out, as the Navi Yeshaya says, with all the silver and all the gold. I want you to take out all the sparks from the world and from yourself so that the Geula should be complete. And that's why the Gullus continues, because with each day there's much more experience and much more wisdom. But then the Rebbe says, but now we have already reached the full height, we've reached the full aging, full maturity. L'chol hadayas, we have reached ripe old age. We don't have to stay anymore in Gullus. We're ready. He says, even if you want to tell me that you need another few seconds in Gullus to get more experience and more wisdom, may God forget all of these calculations. Even though Hashem doesn't forget anything. It says, Ein shichach lifneichi seich v'edecha. There's no forgetfulness in front of God's throne. He says that's true, but the whole exile is lower than God's throne. The whole exile is an aberration. Exile is associated with forgetfulness. So when it comes to forgetting exile, it's exactly the right thing to do. And Hashem shouldn't create nigalin miyad, an immediate redemption in our own days, in our own times, lamata masaret fachim, down here below 10 cubits, al yedei Mashiach tzedkenu, through Mashiach tzedkenu, because the old age has been achieved. Jews have been so many years in Gullus. We have been through so much. He says, L'chol hadayas, we have reached the zitnei b'dei chachamim. The sparks have been elevated and sublimated, and now we are ready for a geula shleima. May it be, as he says, nigolin miyad, an immediate redemption, as the Rambam puts it in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Zayin. Umiyad hey nigolin l'matim asar tzvachim ayedei Mashiach tzidkenu. I just want to add one little postscript, and that is, I heard this a few years ago from the brother of the deceased. This Sicha was said Chaf of Tavshin Lamed Zayin. 3 days earlier, a young woman passed away, Alta Shula Schwartz, Nie Deitch. She was a daughter of Reb Shalom Yeshaya Deitch, Zechrona Levracha, from the famous Russian Chabad legendary Deitch family, known for their love and kindness and powerful Jewish hearts. And Alta Shula, who was married to Reb Shlomo Schwartz, also known as Schwartzy, Zechrona Levracha. They were shluchim in California, UCLA. And this was in 1977. Alta Shula was a young woman, a wife, a mother. She had 7 orphans, and she died suddenly. I think it was at a wedding, Yud Zayin of Tavshin Lamed Zayin, the 17th of 1977. She left 7 young babies, young children. And 3 days later was the Fabrengen in Chafov for the Rebbe's father's yahrzeit. And the siyum the Rebbe made on the whole Seder Kachim and Mesechta Kinin. But as you may have realized, the theme is that as the sheep dies, the one voice, the one sound, is transformed into 7. This woman, Alta Shula Schwartz, Nie Deitch, passed away. She left 7 children, each one a gem in their own way. I have the privilege of knowing many of her children, some of her grandchildren, well, and indeed, her koil, her voice, her passion, her faith, her mesiras nefesh, her wisdom, her kindness continues, and it continues to grow like Ziknei Talmidei Chachamim through her loved ones, as is true with all of our loved ones who have passed on. And the voices, the sounds of the original sheep, of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, of our fathers and mothers, continue through us. And not just continue, they grow. They acquire much more depth, and much more power, and much more potency. A few years later, her sister passed away at a very young age. Her name was Rachaleah, Mrs. Rachaleah Schusterman, who was married then to Reb Gershon, so sein gesund. They were shluchim in Long Beach, California. She also passed away suddenly. This was in 1986. Alta Shula passed away, Yud Zayin of Tavshin Lamed Zayin. Mrs. Schusterman passed away, I think Daled Nis and Tavshin Mem Vav, if I'm not mistaken, 1986. Also from the Deitch family. And so a few years ago, I was talking to a brother of these two sisters, Rebbe Avram Moshe Deitch, Shlita soll sein gesund, Larich Zem Mishanim Toivis. And he told me that Chafov, he was sitting Shiva. He and his brothers, also on the Olam HaEmes, Reb Zalman Deitch, Zechrona Levracha, Rabbi Yosef Deitch, Zechrona Levracha, very, very special people, extraordinary hearts, extraordinary people, Jews, Chassidim, husbands, fathers, grandfathers, very, very special people, very special family. And he told me he was sitting Shiva with his siblings for their sister. And people came after the Fabrengen and they shared. I don't know if they heard the hookup in the house, I'm not sure. I don't know if they had hookups then in the houses. But he said people shared that the Rebbe just made a whole siyum where he articulated this powerful idea of the keves, ksho chayid is one koil, ksho meis koile shiva. Applying it to Jewish history, how we all become a continuum of the voices of our parents, of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and not only don't we do just continue it, but it continues to grow and grow and grow. And that's what allows the sheep to grow and to prosper and gives it the protection of the shepherd until that moment that the Rebbe speaks here at the end of the Sicha, when the sheep has grown old enough and we have acquired all the wisdom and all the depth and all the experience we need. And he says, if there's more to acquire, may God forget about that little extra dosage. Forget about all the calculations, because Gullus comes from a place where forgetfulness exists. Gullus comes from a place below the throne where there is forgetfulness. And we should experience Nigalin Miyad, an immediate redemption, with all of our people and with all of the generations and with the entire world. And as he finishes off, Lamata Me'asaret Fachem Ayedei Mashiach Tzidkenu. Amen v'amen. Thank you very much. Good night. I would love to learn with you all the footnotes, but that would be another few hours, literally. It would be another 6-7 hours. And I think the shir was long, was long enough. But I would encourage everybody. This is Parshas Tazria. Take the next few days and learn through the Sicha. If you have a chance, learn through the Mara Mekaymis, learn through the footnotes, look up the sources, and you'll see much more depth and many more layers that we didn't even get into in the whole discussion and the whole conversation. There's a lot of sugyas that are discussed, especially in the Ha'aris and the Mara Mekaymis, sugyas in Kachim, sugyas in Avodah Zarah, sugyas in Chatas Ha'oif, Oilas Ha'oif, Chatas Ha'oif Ha'ba'ala Safek. It's very, very geschmackis sugyas. It would be very worthwhile to learn through it, and a lot of other things that get discussed in the footnotes. We also see here a certain approach. This was the approach of the Rebbe to learning. We get a little taste of his derech halimud. First of all, how there's nothing that just says in the Mishnah because it says. It says in the Mishnah because it's part of the theme. Also, a very big focus on really getting down to the core of every inyan. Not just discussing a detail or a nuance, not even dissecting a certain aspect, but really getting down to the core, and not just to the halachic core, but also to the spiritual core. We also see the interconnectedness between the whole Torah. I just want to add, I don't know that anybody knows for sure why the Rebbe gave the siyum, and if the siyum was connected to the event I spoke about. It was just something that people felt, and they speculated about, and they shared it, so I just felt it would be appropriate to give it over. But somebody asks me if I have a source connecting it. I don't know. I can't say that this is the reason. The Rebbe didn't explain why he's giving this siyum. He explained the reason he's giving the siyum because he was talking about karbonis and parad, whatever. It's a whole sicha, but in terms of was it connected to this event, it's very hard for me to know. I'm certainly not in the position to be able to answer that, but it was certainly quite moving and fascinating and certainly very comforting on some level during such a tragedy to be able to hear this message from the Rebbe at the time. So I just felt it was appropriate to share. And also, one of the children of Alter Shula is an old friend of mine. We grew up together, he's a classmate of mine. And years ago he said, this Sicha that the Rebbe said in the middle of the Shiva for his mother, he was 5 years old at the time. But he said, this Sicha is a very, very complex and nuanced Sicha. And he hopes one day that I should learn and teach the Sicha in a thorough way so he should be able to really appreciate it. So that's what we did tonight. And I felt it was just appropriate to add this last postscript about the time that the Rebbe said this Sicha. Somebody sent me a photo a few years ago of, there was a store on Kingston Avenue. It was called Essen Bench. Today, I think Mendy's is there. There's a store, Mendy's, Kingston Avenue, right across from 77. It's called Essen Bench. Essen Bench. It was like a deli. You buy hot dogs and mustard. And somebody sent me a picture middle of the night, my father, Olav Shalom, standing in front of Essen Bench, sipping a drink, or somebody else near him is sipping a drink, and he's talking to some people. And it's just a beautiful picture. And I didn't know when it was taken. My brother told me that it was taken after this Fabrengen, Chav of Tavshan Lamed Zayin, 20th of 77. It looks like, I think it was taken around, 1 or 2 or 2:30 in the morning. It was a long Fabrengen. So after the Fabrengen, people would go out and buy a drink and schmooze. The streets was full. The streets were full with people. So it's a picture of my father at the end of this Fabrengen. And it was very moving because it's like part of history. It's just a picture of my father standing on Kingston Avenue with some people. It's a very beautiful, very nice shot. I'll ask my person to put it up here on the video so you'll see it, but it happens to be after this Fabrengen. And it's just moving because it was a beautiful Fabrengen. The Rebbe spoke about a lot of amazing topics. This Sicha was a Sicha that was, I think, 124 minutes, which was a very long Sicha. I think it was around 120. It was a very, very long Sicha. It was, I think more than 2 hours. I think so. I have to check it up. But it was a very long Sicha, extremely long. The Siyum Kinin. It was the Rebbe said that, and then he continued it. Parshas Eikev, Parshas Re'eh. It was a very, very long Sicha. It was a Hadran on Kotchem. It was a Siyum on Kotchem. The Rebbe was making for his father's yard site. So this was just one Sicha from that Fabrengen. It was a Fabrengen rich with a lot of discussions and a lot of sugyas and halacha and in Gemara and in Parshas Hashavua and in Nigla and in Nister and in Rambam and in Shas and in Poskim and different contemporary elements in Jewish life. But this was one of the crown jewels of that Fabrengen, the Siyum on Mesechta Kinin in Likkutei Sichos Parshas Tazria. Thank you.